Hey everyone! Welcome back to Muse Fanfiction. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry had a divine crafting system that built magical artifacts stronger than anything Dumbledore ever owned? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1. The weight of waking. The cupboard under the stairs had a smell that Harry Potter knew better than he knew his own face. Dust and old wood and something that might have been motor oil from Uncle Vernon's toolbox, which had been stored in there 3 summers ago before Harry got moved in. Old trainers. The particular staleness of air that never quite circulated. He knew every inch of it in the dark, the low beam that caught his forehead if he sat up too fast, the loose nail on the left wall where he hung his school bag during term, the exact number of steps it took for Aunt Petunia's footsteps to reach him from the kitchen. 10 years old, Harry Potter had never once thought his life was anything other than what it was. That changed the morning of his 11th birthday. He woke at exactly 3 in the morning, though he had no clock and no particular reason to know that. He simply knew it, the way you sometimes know things in that strange clarity between sleep and waking. The cupboard was dark. The house was silent except for Uncle Vernon's snoring, which moved through the walls like a slow earthquake. Then his left hand began to glow. Not dramatically. Not like a lightning strike or a burst of flame. It was quiet and golden, the color of sunlight pushing through a jar of honey, and it pulsed in his palm with something that felt, impossibly, like a heartbeat. Harry stared at it. He pressed his other hand against it. The glow seeped between his fingers, warm and utterly unconcerned with being hidden. He expected panic. He'd done accidental magic before, shrunk a teacher's wig, turned his hair back when Aunt Petunia shaved it, released a boa constrictor at the zoo, but it had always felt like sneezing. Involuntary. Gone before he understood it. This was different. This was patient. Something spoke. Not in his ears. Somewhere behind them, or maybe below his thoughts, in the space where instinct lived. It wasn't words exactly, more like the shape of words, the impression of a voice that sounded like a fire that had been burning for a very long time. You have been asleep, it said, or suggested, or breathed into the back of his mind. Long enough. Harry sat up. Caught the beam with his forehead. Swore quietly. Your first lesson, the voice continued, with what Harry could only describe as amusement, is to duck. He rubbed his forehead and stared at his still glowing hand. What are you? He whispered. The feeling that came back wasn't a direct answer. It was an image, a forge, ancient and enormous, burning with a fire that was every color at once. Standing over it, a figure he couldn't quite see, pouring something from their hands into the flame. Creating. And then a sense of connection, of a thread running from that figure down through time, through blood, through generation after generation, until it reached the cramped dark of this cupboard and settled into the chest of one small, underfed boy with his dead mother's eyes. Inheritance, the voice offered. And also a beginning. Harry sat in the dark with the golden light pooling in his hand for a long time after that, turning it over, watching it pool and shift. He didn't sleep again. By the time morning came and Aunt Petunia's sharp knock rattled the cupboard door, he was calm in a way he couldn't have explained. Something had clicked into place. Something that had always been slightly wrong about the shape of his own life had suddenly, quietly, aligned. He didn't know what it meant yet. But he knew it was his. The letter arrived that same morning, while the glow had faded but the warmth remained, low in his chest, like an ember waiting. He'd half expected something to happen on his birthday, he'd always had a faint, irrational hope on every birthday that something would change, though he could never say what. When Aunt Petunia dropped the stack of mail on the kitchen table and a thick envelope of yellowish parchment slid out from between the electric bill and a catalog for garden furniture, Harry felt something in that ember leap. He reached for it before he consciously decided to. Aunt Petunia grabbed his wrist. That, she said, her voice doing the specific thing it did when she was frightened and performing anger to cover it, is not for you. But she was wrong, and they both knew it, because his name was right there in green ink, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, and the address of his actual, specific, humiliating living situation was written out in full, which meant whoever sent this letter knew exactly who he was and exactly how he lived, and that, if nothing else, seemed to demand attention. What followed was 4 days of letters. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Pouring through the mail slot, down the chimney, out of the eggs at breakfast until Uncle Vernon's face had passed through several distinct shades of purple and they were all, inexplicably, driving to a rock in the middle of the sea in a rented motorboat. Harry spent those 4 days in something close to private delight. Every time a new letter arrived, that warmth in his chest pulsed once, acknowledging it, and the voice, which he'd started thinking of simply as the Forge, because it felt like the right name for something that hot and that old, would offer a single impression, soon. On the rock, in the middle of the storm, when the door came off its hinges and Rubeus Hagrid ducked through the frame and said, "Harry, you're a wizard," Harry nodded once, as if confirming something he'd been waiting to have confirmed. Hagrid stared at him. "You're not surprised?" "Not exactly," Harry said honestly. "Happy birthday to me, though." Hagrid looked bewildered and then delighted and then handed him a squashed birthday cake, and that, at least, was genuinely unexpected and wonderful. Diagon Alley hit him like a wave he hadn't seen coming. He'd expected shops. He'd expected magic. He hadn't expected to feel the Forge flare to life the moment he stepped through the leaky cauldron and into that cobbled, impossible street, hadn't expected it to ignite in his chest like someone had thrown open a furnace door, so bright and sudden he actually stopped walking. Hagrid, 3 steps ahead, turned. "You all right, Harry?" "Fine," Harry said, breathing through it. "Just, yeah. Fine." The Forge was interested. That was the only word for it. As he walked past shop windows full of silver instruments and glass vials and dark lacquered boxes and wands on velvet cushions, the warmth in his chest shifted and pointed, like a compass needle finding north. It tugged him toward a window filled with what looked like raw materials, coils of copper wire wrapped in what seemed to be dragon hide, chunks of something that glittered like geode but pulsed with faint blue light, long flat slabs of a dark metal he'd never seen before. The sign above read, "Borwick and Fell, rare materials for the discerning practitioner." He made a mental note and kept walking with Hagrid, but the Forge kept one warm eye on that shop the entire time. Gringotts was all cold marble and goblin stairs and a cart that made his stomach drop through the floor, and then there was a vault with a mountain of gold in it, and Harry stood in front of it for a moment trying to understand that it was his. His parents. His mother's love and his father's legacy, converted somehow into galleons. He took what he needed for school supplies. Then, on instinct, he took a bit more. Hagrid gave him a questioning look. "Materials," Harry said simply. "For school." "Sort of." They went to Madame Malkin's and he met Draco Malfoy, who was having his robes fitted and spoke the way people speak when they've never once been told no. He talked about Quidditch and Muggles and blood and which house he'd get into with the casual certainty of someone narrating a story they already know the ending to. Harry listened and offered very little, and when Draco asked what his surname was, Harry said, "Potter," and watched the other boy's face do something complicated. "Harry Potter?" Draco said. "Blimey. People keep saying that," Harry said, which wasn't true but felt like it would be soon. Draco recovered quickly. That, Harry noticed, was something the boy was practiced at. "Well," he said, "I suppose we'll be seeing each other at school." "Probably," Harry agreed, and went back to thinking about the materials shop. They hit it last, because Hagrid had tried to skip it entirely, bless him, and Harry had simply said he needed it and that had been that. The shop was small and organized with a fastidiousness that felt almost aggressive. 2 witches browsed near the back. The wizard at the counter, Borwick, presumably, a short man with a magnificent mustache and very precise hands, looked up when Harry came in and then looked down and then looked up again. "The usual, is it?" he said. "First time," Harry said. "I need," and then he paused, because what he needed wasn't exactly on a school list. He let the Forge guide him, following that warmth towards certain shelves. A small coil of what the label said was lay-touched copper wire, grade 3. A flat piece of stone the size of his palm that was labeled runic schist, volcanic, unworked. A small jar of something that looked like black sand with silver threads running through it, astral iron dust, fine grade. He brought them to the counter and paid without asking the price first, which made Borwick's mustache twitch with approval. Unusual purchases for a first year, the man said, not quite a question. I'm an unusual first year, Harry said pleasantly. Outside, Hagrid looked at the small wrapped parcel in Harry's hands with an expression of gentle confusion that Harry was beginning to understand was the man's natural state. What you need all that for? I'm not sure yet, Harry said honestly. But I will be. The forge pulsed once in agreement. Ollivander's was the last stop before ice cream, and it was the stop that mattered. The shop had that particular quality of silence that isn't actually quiet, more like everything in it was waiting, thousands of narrow boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each one containing something that was almost but not quite alive. Mr. Ollivander materialized from the back of the shop the way shadows sometimes move when you're not quite watching, silver eyes landing on Harry immediately. I wondered when I'd see you, he said. Harry Potter. Mr. Ollivander, Harry said. Your mother, Willow, 10¼ inches, swishy. Wonderful for charms work. The old man's eyes went briefly somewhere else. Your father, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable. Excellent for transfiguration. He refocused on Harry. And you'll be needing something altogether different, I'd imagine. The wand fitting was strange, the way Ollivander's fittings were always strange. Try this one, try that one, boxes hitting the floor, some wands producing sparks or gusts of wind or accidental music. Nothing quite fitting. Harry tried 14 wands and each time the forge gave a quiet negative impression, a gentle not that one. Then Ollivander, with an expression Harry couldn't read, brought out a box that he held differently than the others, more carefully, the way you hold something that might answer back. I wondered, the old man said quietly, more to himself than to Harry, whether this one would ever find its person. He opened the box. Holly, 11 inches, phoenix feather core. A curious combination. Holly is a wood that chooses its wielder based on those who must surmount formidable obstacles. He looked at Harry over the tops of invisible glasses. The phoenix who gave this feather gave only one other. Its brother wand, well. You'll know of it. Harry took the wand. The warmth in his chest exploded outward, not painfully but completely, like a door thrown open on a summer morning, and golden red sparks streamed from the tip of the wand and caught the dust in the air, and for a moment the whole dim shop was full of light. Ollivander stared. Not at the light. At Harry's hands. Because for just a moment, one single, blazing moment, the golden glow of the forge had surfaced on Harry's skin, running along the lines of his fingers like the gilded veins of a leaf held up to the sun. It was gone in an instant. But Ollivander had seen it. The old man was quiet for a long, breathing moment. Then he said, very carefully, Mr. Potter. May I ask, have you crafted anything yet? Harry blinked. No. Not yet. But you will. It wasn't a question. I think so, Harry said. Ollivander looked at him for a long time with an expression that moved through several things Harry couldn't name. Then he wrapped the wand in purple tissue, placed it in its box, and held it out. Take very good care of that wand, Mr. Potter, he said. And be careful with what you build. Things that are made well outlast the people who made them. That is both the gift and the burden. Harry took the box. He turned to go. Mr. Potter. Ollivander's voice was barely above a whisper. What I saw on your hands just now. I have read of it, in texts most wizards don't know exist. The Artificer's Mark. He paused. The last person known to carry it lived in the 14th century. She made things that are still in use today, in places you wouldn't expect. Another pause. She was also more powerful than anyone who has ever held the Elder Wand. Harry stood in the doorway. The late afternoon light came in from Diagon Alley behind him. "Good to know," he said. The forge spoke to him properly for the first time that night, while Hagrid slept in the rented boat and the storm had quieted to a grey drizzle and Harry sat cross-legged on the floor with the small parcel from Borwick and fell open in his lap. He touched the piece of runic schist and felt the stone hum faintly against his fingers, like a tuning fork held close to its resonant frequency. "The first piece is always the hardest," the forge said, and this time it was closer to actual words than it had ever been before. The voice had the texture of very old wood and the heat of something just removed from flame. "Not because it's most difficult. Because it requires trust. You don't yet trust yourself." "I just met you," Harry said, quietly enough not to wake Hagrid. "You have always known me. I am what is already in you. I give it shape, nothing more. What am I supposed to make?" The impression that came was a specific one, a small disc, palm-sized, carved from the schist. Runes pressed into both faces, ones Harry didn't know consciously but could feel in his hands the way you feel a word you know but can't quite say. The copper wire worked into the disc's edge, anchored by 4 small knots. The iron dust pressed into the carved lines, locked there by a heat that came not from fire but from intention. "What will it do?" Harry thought rather than asked. "It will tell you when someone is lying to you." He spent 3 hours on it. His fingers knew the runes before his mind did, tracing them into the stone with the tip of his new wand and feeling each one lock into place with a small click of rightness. The copper wire fought him at first, it wanted to coil unevenly, wanted to bunch at the curves, and he had to learn, through patience and 3 failed attempts, that it needed to be guided rather than forced. The iron dust he pressed into the carved lines last, and when the final grain settled into the final rune, the disc gave off a single clear tone, not loud, more felt than heard, and went still. Harry held it up. In the grey pre-dawn light it looked like an unremarkable piece of dark stone. He couldn't see anything different about it. He held it and thought of a statement he knew was true. "My name is Harry Potter." The disc sat in his hand, neutral and warm. He thought of something false. "My parents are alive." The disc went cold in his palm. Not painful, just a precise, factual chill, like touching a window in winter. He sat with that for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and lay down and stared at the low ceiling of the rock house while the forge settled back into its steady warmth in his chest, satisfied the way someone is satisfied after good work. The disc told him things were false. He just confirmed one. He breathed through it and went to sleep. Platform 9 3/4 was everything and more, which Harry thought was a strange thing to be but was evidently possible. Steam and noise and owls and parents saying goodbye and trunks being wrestled onto the train, and the train itself, massive, red, improbably beautiful, sitting at the platform like it was the most natural thing in the world, which Harry supposed, here, it was. He found a compartment that was empty and sat by the window and watched families. A woman with very red hair was corralling what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply of children, one of them a boy about Harry's age with the same red hair and a long stripe of something on his nose that might have been dirt. The boy looked at the train, looked at his older brothers climbing aboard, and pulled his shoulders back in the specific way people do when they're nervous and trying not to look it. Harry watched him and felt something, recognition, maybe. He knew that posture intimately. When the boy appeared in the doorway of Harry's compartment with a sheepish expression and asked if it was taken, Harry said no, "Come in," and the boy dropped into the seat across from him with the relief of someone who'd been worrying about where to sit for at least 20 minutes. "I'm Ron," the boy said. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter." Ron stared. Harry waited. Ron said, "Blimey," in roughly the same tone Draco Malfoy had but with entirely different energy. Malfoy's had been calculating, this was just honest surprise, and then Ron seemed to realize he was staring and shook his head and said, "Sorry. Sorry. It's just, do you really have the," and he gestured vaguely at his own forehead. Harry pushed back his hair. The scar was there, as always. Shaped like a bolt of lightning, oddly neat for a wound. Ron looked and then looked away politely, which Harry appreciated. "What's it like?" Ron asked. "Growing up, I mean, do you remember anything?" No," Harry said. "I grew up in a cupboard." Ron blinked. "A what?" "Cupboard. Under the stairs. In my aunt and uncle's house." Harry said it the way he'd learned to say uncomfortable things that weren't going to change by dancing around them. "They're muggles." "They're not very, they didn't want me." "That's awful," Ron said immediately and simply, without any of the performance that people sometimes did with pity, and Harry found he didn't mind it. It was. "It's over," Harry said. "Tell me about your family." "That was your mum at the platform?" Ron's face did something complicated and warm. "Yeah. 7 of us kids. I've got, well, Bill and Charlie are already out of school, Percy's a prefect, Fred and George are 3rd years, and Ginny's at home. She's devastated she can't come yet." He smiled a bit. "It's loud. We don't have much money. But yeah. It's good." "Sounds good," Harry said, and meant it completely. The forge was quiet during most of the train journey, simply warm, occasionally directing his attention outward to notice things, the castle they passed at sunset, distant and turreted, that made his heart lift oddly, the way Ron's freckles were exactly 9 on one side and 7 on the other, the compartment door opening halfway through to admit a bushy-haired girl with a cat carrier and an air of complete authority. "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost one." "No," Harry and Ron said. She started to leave and then looked at Harry and did the same double-take everyone did and then didn't comment on the scar, instead tilting her head and saying, "You must be Harry Potter." "I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts." "I hope it was flattering," Harry said. "It was mostly just historical." She looked at him with the precise assessment of someone taking rapid and accurate inventory. Then her eyes moved to the small dark disc that Harry had taken out and was turning in his fingers. "What's that?" Harry turned it once more. "Something I made." Hermione sat down without being invited. "You made something? On the train?" "No. Last night." "What does it do?" He considered her for a moment. The disc sat in his palm and was entirely neutral, she wasn't saying anything yet. "Tells me when people are lying," he said. She looked at the disc and then at him and then at the disc again and something shifted in her expression, the particular shift of someone who has just realized that the world is slightly larger than they'd mapped it. "That's not on the school list," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's technically a runic artifact." "I suppose it is. First-year students aren't expected to know runic artificing. It's not taught until 6th year and even then it's an elective." "Hermione," Ron said, apparently feeling this had gone on long enough, "he just made one." "I think he already knows." She looked at Ron as though noticing him properly for the first time and then looked back at Harry. "How did you know how to do it?" Harry thought about that carefully. The honest answer was complex and the simple answer felt right. "It came naturally," he said. The disc was entirely still in his hand. Hermione made a small humming sound, which he'd learn later meant she had approximately 15 follow-up questions and was deciding which to fire first, and then the trolley came round and Ron bought a mountain of chocolate frogs and she produced a very organized lunch from a sensible bag, and the train rolled on toward Scotland. Hogwarts at night from the lake was one of those things that Harry would later understand he would remember until he died. The castle lit from within, towers and battlements throwing reflected light across the water, the mountains rising behind it dark against a sky that was crowded with more stars than he'd ever seen, and the fleet of small boats carrying them in silence across water that was absolutely still despite there being no reason for it to be. The forge blazed in his chest. Not just warmth now, recognition. This place was old with magic, layered and deep, and the forge responded to it the way a tuning fork responds to the right note. Harry sat in a boat with Ron and Neville Longbottom, who had retrieved his toad, Trevor, with Hermione's help, and stared at the castle getting larger and felt something he couldn't name but which was close to home, which was a word he'd never really had a practical relationship with before. He pressed his hand against his pocket where the truth disc sat, and the disc was warm with the ambient magic of the place. "This is where it starts," the forge said. "Yeah," Harry murmured, too quietly for Ron to hear over the sound of the water. "There is old craft in those stones. Old mistakes. Old ambitions." A pause like a banked fire breathes. "You will need to be careful, Harry. Not because you are weak. But because those who mistake strength for threat will come for what you carry." "Let them," Harry said. He hadn't meant it to sound like that, flat and simply certain. But it came out that way, and it felt right, so he left it. The boats docked. They climbed up to the castle. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall in a way that made it very clear she was not a person who told you things twice, and Harry listened carefully while also cataloguing everything around him: the torches, the moving portraits, the faint lines of runework in the walls that were invisible to most but that glowed faintly gold at the edges of his vision. The magic in this building was immense and old and built. Someone had once loved these stones and worked them carefully, layer by layer. He wanted to know who. The sorting was what it was. The hat, to his quiet satisfaction, went back and forth for nearly a full minute before landing on Gryffindor, and he sat down at the long table to the sound of red and gold celebration with the feeling that this was correct. The hat had whispered about Slytherin. About ambition. He wasn't unambitious. But ambition without people around you is just ego, and he'd had enough ego without people in the Dursleys to last a lifetime. Ron landed next to him. Hermione 2 seats down. He felt the table fill up around him like something settling into alignment. Dumbledore stood at the head of the hall, and the forge went quiet. Not silent. Just watchful. Harry looked at the old man, the half-moon glasses and the long silver beard and the robes that were a particular shade of deep purple, the posture of someone who was comfortable being the most important person in every room, and felt the disc in his pocket warm briefly, prompted by no statement, just proximity. He watched Dumbledore smile at the new students and thought, very carefully and without drama, "What are you not saying?" He didn't know yet. He had time. Dinner arrived and it was extraordinary, and Ron ate with the focused dedication of someone who knows good food is finite, and Hermione whispered things about the enchanted ceiling, and Harry ate and listened and laughed at Percy's pompous welcome speech, and the forge banked down to its comfortable resting heat, and Hogwarts spread around him in all directions like something that had been waiting for him. In his pocket, the disc sat warm and patient. After dinner, carried upstairs on the flow of new students following Percy's prefect's badge, Harry passed a door on the third-floor corridor that was newer than the stone around it. Not visibly. But the forge tugged, briefly and precisely, toward it. He filed it away. In the dormitory, after Ron had fallen asleep mid-sentence about his brother Charlie and dragons, Harry took out the disc and held it for a moment, then placed it on the nightstand beside his glasses. He lay back and stared at the ceiling where someone had, centuries ago, carved small runes into the stone that no one else probably noticed, faint and worn, designed to encourage restful sleep. They worked. He could feel them. He thought, whoever built this place was very good. The forge agreed, warm and solid in his chest, and Harry Potter closed his eyes on his first night at Hogwarts and slept better than he had in 10 years. Outside the dormitory windows, the Scottish mountains were dark against a sky full of stars. Somewhere in the castle, something very old felt, for the first time in centuries, the presence of a maker, and recognized it, the way all old things recognize their own kind. Harry slept. The forge kept watch. Tomorrow, he had a great deal to build. Chapter 2, Iron and Intent. The first week of Hogwarts was, in Harry's honest assessment, a controlled avalanche. Classes hit him from 6 directions at once: transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, history of magic, and defense against the dark arts, each with its own textbooks and its own style of difficulty and its own professor who had a particular way of making clear what kind of student they expected you to be. McGonagall wanted precision and didn't say please. Flitwick wanted enthusiasm and meant it. Sprout wanted patience with things that were muddy and alive. Binns was a ghost who had apparently been dead long enough that he'd forgotten lectures were supposed to have a pulse. And Snape. Harry had been warned about Snape by Ron, who'd heard about him from every older sibling he possessed, but warnings are structural things, they give you the shape of a problem without its weight. The weight of Snape was different. The man moved through the dungeons like weather moving through a mountain pass, cold and deliberate and entirely indifferent to anyone's comfort. He looked at Harry on the first day with eyes that were doing complicated things Harry couldn't fully read, and then he said, "Potter," the way other people said "problem," and Harry met his gaze steadily and said, "Professor," and something in Snape's expression flickered before locking back into its default contempt. The famous question ambush on the first day, Bezoar, monkshood, aconite, what would you get if you added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood, hit Harry like a thrown stone. He didn't know the answers. He said so clearly rather than guessing wildly, which Snape somehow managed to make sound worse, and Harry docked his irritation somewhere practical and spent that evening in the library reading about Bezoars until Hermione appeared at his elbow with 3 additional books and an expression that suggested she'd been there mentally for some time. "You know," she said, setting the books down with a decisive click, "most people would just say they weren't prepared and move on." "I wasn't prepared," Harry said. "I don't intend for that to happen again." She looked at him. "You're going to memorize all of first-year potions tonight, aren't you?" "Tonight and tomorrow," he said. "Is there something wrong with that?" "Not at all," she said, and sat down across from him, and that was that. Ron found them an hour later, dropped into a chair with an expression of deep exhaustion, and produced a nearly destroyed chocolate frog card from his pocket. "Percy just gave me a 20-minute talk about student priorities," he said. "I've been standing in the common room for 20 minutes. I need people who are not Percy." "We're people," Harry said without looking up. "Brilliant," Ron said, and borrowed Hermione's second-best book without asking, which she noticed and chose not to mention. It was, without discussion or formal agreement, the shape their friendship took on. The truth disc went everywhere Harry went. He wore it on a cord around his neck, tucked under his robes, and its weight became as familiar as his glasses or his wand. He was careful not to make it obvious, not out of fear, but because a tool used subtly is more useful than one that announces itself. What he learned in the first week through it surprised him less than it should have. It went cold when Percy told first-years they'd love their coursework. Cold when a Slytherin named Pansy Parkinson told another girl she looked wonderful. Cold when Professor Quirrell, Defense Against Dark Arts professor, a twitchy, turbaned man with a nervous laugh, told his first-year class that they'd all be perfectly safe and he'd make sure of it personally. That one was the most interesting cold. It had a specific quality. Not the mild chill of a casual social lie. More like the disc had been dropped into ice water. Harry said nothing about it. Just watched Quirrell through the lesson with the particular attention he'd learned to pay to things that felt wrong. Quirrell was performing nervousness. That was Harry's conclusion by the end of that first week. It was very convincing and had probably fooled everyone who wasn't looking for the seams in it. But there's a specific texture to real anxiety, a scatteredness, an inability to maintain focus, that was absent in Quirrell when he thought no one was watching him. In those moments, between the stuttering and the fidgeting, there was something underneath that was still and watchful and entirely unlike the man's public face. Harry didn't tell Ron or Hermione. Not yet. He needed to understand it better before he brought them into it. Instead, he went to the library. The restricted section was, naturally, restricted, which was an obstacle Harry acknowledged, catalogued, and then moved around by identifying that Madame Pants went for her tea at precisely 3:30 every afternoon and that there was a particular loose hinge on the gate that kept the restricted section separate, which he fixed, silently, just for the satisfaction of it, but not before using it. He wasn't looking for dangerous texts. He was looking for something specific, anything about runic artificing. Anything about the history of magical construction. Anything about what the forge was, in the language that old wizarding scholarship might use to describe it. He found, over 3 afternoons, the following, a text called Principia Fabricandi that was 400 years old and written in dense, excited Latin by someone who clearly loved their subject more than they loved being understood, a narrower volume called the Artificer's Record, which was a historical document more than a guide, cataloguing known practitioners of runic artificing from the 10th century to the 16th, and a slim pamphlet of maybe 20 pages, handwritten, with no title on the cover, tucked into the spine of a much larger book as though someone had hidden it there and forgotten. The pamphlet, when he opened it, was written in English, or something close to English, close enough that it took only a bit of patience to decode. And it was addressed, quite directly, to the next one who carries the mark. Harry sat very still in the dim light of the restricted section and read. The writer's name was Elspeth Cavendish, and she had lived, according to the Artificer's Record, from 1312 to 1389, which meant she had died before completing whatever she'd been working on. Her handwriting was sharp and angular and suggested someone whose thoughts moved faster than her hand. The pamphlet was part instruction, part personal account, and it began with a sentence that made the forge blaze so hard Harry had to press his hand against his sternum. If you are reading this, the mark has come to you, which means it has skipped again, likely generations, possibly centuries, likely to someone who had no idea such a thing was possible. Welcome. I am sorry for the timing. These things never come at convenient moments. He read it twice. Then a third time. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. The mark, Elspeth wrote, was not a curse or a gift from any external entity. It was a convergence, a specific alignment of magical capacity, intent, and lineage that produced, in the person it settled in, the ability to work magic into physical materials in a way that standard enchanting or charm work couldn't replicate. Standard enchanting layered magic onto an object. Artificing wove it through the crystal lattice of stone, through the grain of metal, through the molecular structure of the material itself. The result was artifacts that were not enchanted objects but were, in a technical sense, alive. They didn't think. But they persisted. They adapted. They remembered their purpose. The forge you feel, she wrote, is not external. It is your own magical core, given a shape your mind can work with. Think of it as a translation service. Your magic knows what it's doing. The forge teaches your conscious mind to keep up. The last line of the pamphlet read, "Do not be afraid of what you can make. Be careful of what you choose to." There is a difference between building a door and building a weapon, and that difference lives entirely in the intent you carry when you begin. The forge knows the difference. So will everything you ever craft. Harry folded the pamphlet carefully and put it in his pocket next to the disc, which had been warm and still the entire time he read. He looked at his hands. The Artificer's Mark. Elspeth Cavendish. Last known carrier, 14th century. He apparently had it now. Right, he said quietly, to the empty restricted section, to the warm certainty in his chest. Let's not waste it, then. He told Ron and Hermione that Saturday. He did it practically, without preamble, in the corner of the common room after dinner when the space was full enough that their conversation would be private. He put the truth disc on the table between them. He told them about the forge, about Elspeth Cavendish, about the morning of his birthday in the cupboard when the light had started in his palm. He was straightforward about it because the only way to tell people something true and strange is to tell it plainly and let them decide what to do with it. Ron stared at the disc. Hermione read the pamphlet twice and then sat back and said, "Runic Artificer." There are 7 recorded in all of known magical history. 8 now, Harry said. 8 now, she agreed, and there was nothing in her voice but the fact of it. Then she said, "Dumbledore doesn't know." "No. Are you going to tell him?" Harry picked up the disc. He didn't ask it anything. He just turned it in his fingers. "Not yet," he said. "I want to understand it better before anyone else does." Ron had been quiet through all of this, which was unusual enough that Harry glanced at him. Ron was looking at the disc with an expression that was working through several things at once. Then he said, "The stone you made. Can I?" and held out his hand. Harry placed the disc in Ron's palm. "This is really good," Ron said, turning it. "I mean, I can feel it doing something." "Can't you feel it, Hermione?" It's warm, but not just warm, it's resonant," Hermione said quietly. "Yes. I felt it when he put it on the table." She looked at Harry. "Standard enchanted objects have a kind of surface energy. This feels deeper than that. Like it goes all the way through." "It does," Harry said. Ron handed the disc back carefully, both hands, the way you hand back something that matters. He met Harry's eyes and said simply, "What do you need from us?" Harry hadn't been expecting it that directly, and it hit him in a way that warmth and sincerity will always hit someone who hasn't had much of either. He looked at Ron for a moment. Then he said, "Right now. I need Hermione to help me research materials. And I need you to be the person who tells me if I'm being an idiot." Ron grinned. "Brilliant. I'm excellent at that." "I know," Harry said. "I've watched you tell Percy." The Warden's Gauntlet was the Forge's second challenge, and it hit him 3 weeks into term. He woke in the night from a specific dream, not a nightmare but a vision of something being built, hands he recognized as his own pressing runes into dark metal that was still warm from the forge, and the shape of what was being made was unmistakable, a gauntlet. Not a full one, not armored knight style, but a half glove of dark metal that fit over the back of the hand and 3 fingers, leaving the palm free, articulated at the knuckles, traced with rune channels that he could see in the dream as clearly as printed text. He sat up in the dormitory. Ron was snoring softly 2 beds over. The fire in the dormitory hearth had burned down to embers. He took out the pamphlet and the small notebook he'd started using to sketch rune designs. He drew the gauntlet from memory, shape, dimensions, the rune channels and what went in them. It took an hour. When he was done he sat looking at it and the forge confirmed, in that way it did, that the design was right. Not perfect, there were things to figure out, but right in intention. The materials would be the challenge. He had iron dust and copper wire from Borwick and Fell, and the schist, but what the gauntlet wanted was something more substantial, specifically a metal that could carry runic inscription at the molecular level without fracturing under magical load. The pamphlet had a name for it, forged stone iron, smelted with volcanic obsidian and ground moonstone and something called witherbloom root, which Hermione identified from the library as a plant that grew in exactly one place in Britain and was considered almost extinct. "Almost," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "Hagrid," she said, which was what he'd been thinking. Hagrid, when approached with the question the following Saturday afternoon over tea in his hut, massive, sweet tea in a mug the size of a small bucket, lit up like someone had asked him exactly the right question about something he loved, which was essentially what had happened. Hagrid knew about witherbloom root. Hagrid had, in fact, been trying to cultivate a small stand of it near the edge of the Forbidden Forest for 3 years as a personal project. "Course I'll give ya some root," he said. "What you need it for?" "A project," Harry said. "Material research." Hagrid accepted this entirely. "You know," he said, stirring his tea with something the size of a small oar, your mum used to do material research. Not exactly like ye mean, but she was always fiddling with things. Making things better. McGonagall always said she'd have been a great artifice." He stopped himself. Cleared his throat. "Well. Lily Potter was a great witch. Any road." Harry sat with that quietly. His mother. Making things better. The forge was very warm. It took him 2 weeks to assemble the materials and another week to learn the smelting. He couldn't actually smelt metal in Hogwarts, obviously, but Elspeth's pamphlet had a section on this, which he now suspected she'd written specifically because she'd faced the same problem. Runic artificers could smelt without fire. They could use their magical core as the heat source, directing it through their hands into the raw materials, combining them at a structural level rather than a physical one. It was exhausting. The first attempt left him with shaking hands and a headache for 2 days. The second attempt was better. The third produced a small disk of something that was unmistakably different from either of its source materials, darker than iron, with a subtle pattern in its surface like frozen water, and warm to the touch despite sitting on a cold desk. Forged stone iron. He'd made it. About the size of a coin. He held it and felt the forge acknowledge it with something that wasn't quite pride but was close enough. He needed more. He made more. 6 sessions over 2 weeks, always late at night in the dormitory when the others were asleep, hands pressed together around a palm full of combined materials, the forge burning carefully through his core. By the end of October he had enough. Not a great deal, about enough to work with, poured into a shallow mold he'd made from the runic schist, which he'd shaped by spending 3 evenings carefully pressing runeworking into it until the schist accepted the form he needed. The gauntlet took 2 nights. The rune channels came first, inscribed into the cooling forged stone iron with his wand and his fingers alternating, the physical and magical tools working together in the way that felt increasingly natural, like using both hands rather than one. The runes he used were from Elspeth's pamphlet and from his own instinct, which he'd started trusting because it hadn't been wrong yet. Each rune had to be pressed in while the metal was at precisely the right temperature, too hot and it wouldn't hold, too cold and it would crack. He learned the exact feeling of that window. It lived in his fingertips. The articulation at the knuckles was the hard part. Getting the joints to move freely while maintaining the runic integrity across the seams, he ruined the first attempt and had to remelt and recast. The second attempt worked. He sat looking at the knuckle joints, opening and closing the gauntlet over his hand, watching the way the rune channels stayed continuous across the seams, and felt a satisfaction that was quiet and absolute. Then he pressed the final rune, the anchor rune, the one that bound all the others into a coherent function, and the gauntlet settled onto his hand with a warmth like sliding on a well-fitted glove, except better, because it also felt like something settling into him, connecting. He lifted his right hand. He thought, clearly and with intent, protection. A ward field expanded from the gauntlet, invisible to the eye but absolutely tangible, a shell of solid magic that curved around his body at roughly arm's length. He picked up a book from his bedside table and threw it at his own face, which Ron would have found hilarious if he'd been awake to see it. The book hit the ward and stopped dead, as if it had struck glass, and fell to the floor. Harry picked up the book. He looked at the gauntlet. "Right," he said softly, and the forge burned with deep and genuine pleasure. November came in cold and grey and brought, with it, the thing Harry had been watching for since that first potions class. Quirrell cornered him after a Thursday defense lesson. The other students had filed out, and Harry had lingered, not from slowness but from choice, because he'd felt something in the air that day, a quality of attention in Quirrell's nervous glances that had a specific direction. Toward Harry. He stayed and pretended to pack his bag with great focus. "Potter," Quirrell said, in his performative stutter. "A word?" "Of course, Professor," Harry said pleasantly. Quirrell moved around the desk and stood in that particular way people stand when they're trying to appear casual and are not. "How are you finding Hogwarts?" "Wonderful," Harry said, the truth disk warm and still against his sternum. "Settling in?" Not finding things too overwhelming?" "Not at all. Still warm. Still. Good. Quirrell shifted. "I noticed, in your application materials, I understand your B background is quite, muggle-raised, is that right?" "Completely," Harry said. "Nothing unusual, then?" "Growing up?" "Nothing, out of the ordinary." The disc went cold. Not mildly cold. The kind of cold that meant Quirrell already knew the answer to that question and was asking it anyway, which meant this was reconnaissance. Harry filed that away and kept his face easy and open. "I was a perfectly ordinary boy," Harry said, which was not precisely true, but the disc registered it as neither, because he wasn't sure it was false, exactly. The disc was responsive to intent as much as content. Quirrell looked at him for a moment with that stillness underneath the fidgeting. Then the fidgeting reasserted itself and he said, "Well, good then. You're doing very well in class, Mr. Potter. Keep it up," and turned away. Harry shouldered his bag and walked out. In the corridor he let out a slow breath and touched the disc through his robes. He went to find Ron and Hermione. They met in the library at their usual table, in the corner furthest from Madame Pants, and Harry told them what had happened with the economy of someone who'd spent time organizing their thoughts. He laid it out, the disc, the cold response, Quirrell's specific question, the stillness under the performance. Hermione had her thinking face on before he'd finished. "There's something under his turban," she said. Both boys looked at her. "I noticed in the first class," she said, defensive but also absolutely certain. "The smell. Something like old magic. Something not right. And he never lets anyone near it." She paused. "I'd thought I was imagining it." "You're not," Harry said. Ron leaned forward. "So what's under the turban?" "I don't know," Harry said. "But whatever it is, it's interested in me. And it's not Quirrell doing the being interested." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "Right," Ron said. "So Quirrell is like a person who has a passenger." "That's a very good way to put it," Harry said. "Who is the passenger?" Hermione asked, though from her face she had a hypothesis she didn't want to say. Harry looked at her steadily. She looked back. Neither of them said the name. They didn't have to. "He can't do anything to me in a school full of people," Harry said. "What I need to do is understand why he's looking. What does he want from me? It's not the obvious answer. If he wanted to harm me, there were 20 chances in the past 2 months. He wants to know what you are," Hermione said quietly. "He could feel something, probably. If what the pamphlet says is true, that what you carry is ancient and distinct, he felt the forge," Harry said. "He felt the forge," she agreed. "And he doesn't know what it is. And things like him, a careful way to say it, a precise way, hate not knowing what they're dealing with." Harry nodded slowly. In his chest, the forge was very quiet and very clear, the way it got when it was paying close attention to something. "Then," Harry said, "let's make sure the first time he finds out is on our terms." The first Quidditch practice of the season saved his life, or at least his afternoon, which was equivalent. Oliver Wood was enthusiastic in a way that transcended normal enthusiasm and became something closer to a calling, and training Harry as Hogwarts' youngest seeker in a century was clearly the kind of challenge that gave Oliver's life structure and meaning. Harry, on a broomstick, was something he hadn't expected from himself. He'd never been on one before the day McGonagall had caught him saving Neville's Remembrall from Malfoy's petty cruelty, a catch that had involved a 40-foot dive he'd done entirely on instinct, his body apparently already knowing what his mind was still catching up to. On the pitch, in practice, with November air cold enough to strip the thinking out of everything, he found a clarity that was different from the quiet focus of crafting. This was faster. Bigger. The forge went easy and warm while he flew, unconcerned, as if flight was simply a natural expression of what he was. He caught the practice snitch 3 times in 20 minutes. Would look like he might cry with happiness. Malfoy watched from the stands with an expression Harry couldn't quite see from 50 feet up. After practice, walking back to the castle with mud on his boots and windburn on his face, Harry passed close enough to the third-floor corridor to feel the forge tug, that same distinct pull toward the new door he'd noted on his first night. He stopped. Looked at it. The door, from a hallway perspective, was entirely unremarkable. Stone frame, iron handle, nothing to distinguish it from any of the dozen other doors on this floor. But there was something behind it. Something old and powerful and protected. He could feel the runic layering in the walls around it even from the corridor. Whoever had put up those wards had been very good. Multiple layered protections. Not Hogwarts standard. Something additional. Something deliberate. He didn't try to open it. He noted it with great precision and walked on. The forge said, in its impression language, patience. I know, Harry said. I'm learning. The troll was, objectively, the worst thing to happen in November and also, in some ways, the best. He and Ron were already running toward the girls' bathrooms before Hermione had any idea anyone was coming. They'd heard about the troll in the dungeon from the general chaos of Halloween dinner being abandoned, worked out that Hermione was still in the bathroom because Ron had said something categorically unkind to her that morning and she'd been avoiding them, and then the decision to go get her had been made between them without either of them formally making it. What Harry hadn't expected was to arrive at the bathroom ahead of the troll. He had about 90 seconds. Hermione was pressed against the far wall of the bathroom, the troll lumbering through the doorway, and Harry already had the gauntlet on. He'd been wearing it more consistently in the castle, pulled from his bag in the running chaos, settling onto his right hand with that click of connection. Hermione, get behind something solid, he said, very calmly, and she was too frightened to do anything but follow the instruction. The troll swung its club at him. The ward field from the gauntlet snapped out and the club hit it and stopped dead, which was not what the troll expected. The troll seemed to think about this for a moment. Harry thought, not protection. Redirection. The ward could do both, it was in the design. He shifted his intent and the troll swung again, and this time the ward deflected rather than blocked, sending the club sideways into the stall wall with a crack of broken stone. Ron, from the doorway, hit the troll with a jet of water from his wand, a first-year charm that wouldn't hurt it but hit it in the face and made it stumble. Harry shot a Wingardium Leviosa at the club and yanked it out of the troll's grip, which Flitwick would have been delighted to see done with such conviction, and let the club crash against the ceiling and fall behind the troll, which made it spin and lose its balance, and then Harry drove his wand forward and said, Petrificus Totalis, with an intent behind it that his wand translated into something considerably more forceful than the textbook version, and the troll went rigid and hit the floor. So hard the walls shook. Silence. Hermione came out from behind a stall partition. She looked at the troll. She looked at Harry's hand, the gauntlet, the still pulsing rune channels. What, she said carefully, is that? Ward gauntlet, Harry said, pulling it off and putting it in his bag as footsteps came thundering down the corridor. I'll explain later. McGonagall arrived first, with Snape and Quirrell immediately behind. Snape's eyes went to Harry's bag with the specific attention of someone whose instincts were very good. Quirrell's went to Harry's face, and then, for just a fraction of a second, in a way no one else in the room could have noticed, to Harry's hand. The right hand. The one the gauntlet had been on. The disc against Harry's chest went cold and stayed cold for the entire time Quirrell was in the room. McGonagall took points. Gave them back. Hermione's covering story about going to face the troll on a dare was the most technically creative lie Harry had heard from her so far, and he appreciated it on multiple levels. Her eyes said we will be talking about this and his expression said absolutely, and then they went to the Halloween feast. Under the table in the Great Hall, Ron said quietly, the troll hit a wall and bounced. More or less, Harry said. Ron processed this for a moment. Then, I want to see what else it can do sometime. Harry smiled. Eventually. Hermione, on his other side, said nothing at all, but she took a bread roll and ate it with the expression of someone reorganizing their entire understanding of what was possible. The forge, warm in Harry's chest, found that very satisfying. The night before December, the last night before the Christmas break emptied the castle of most of its inhabitants, Harry sat at the workbench he'd set up in the corner of the dormitory. Ron and Hermione had covered for his late nights with the simple efficiency of people who decided this was important, and took stock. The gauntlet was finished and functioning. The truth disc was seasoned now, refined by weeks of use, more sensitive than when he'd made it. He had notes on 6 new designs, some simple, some ambitious, all drawn from the Forge's guidance and Elspeth's pamphlet and his own growing understanding of what was possible. He had a working theory about Quirrell and what was under the turban. He had 2 friends he hadn't expected and didn't intend to lose. He had the pull of that third-floor corridor, patient and waiting. He took out his notebook and turned to a new page. Drew, from memory and the Forge's prompting, the outline of his next challenge, not the gauntlet's successor, something different. A disc, like the truth disc but larger. Set into a frame of worked forged stone iron. With rune channels that described, in 7 stages, the following function: show what is hidden. The compass of true sight. He wasn't ready for it yet. The materials alone would take months. But he sketched it in full, every detail the forge provided, and when he was done the drawing had the same quality as a thing that was already real, just waiting for time to catch up with it. He put the notebook away. Packed his bag for the morning. Through the dormitory window, snow was beginning to fall over Hogwarts, soft and windless, settling on the battlements and the towers and the grounds, covering everything in a white that made the castle look like something out of a story about places where important things happened. Harry looked at it for a while. In his chest, the forge burned steadily. He had work to do. He was not afraid of it. He was not afraid of Quirrell or what rode in him or of Dumbledore watching from the top of the castle with his careful, measuring gaze or of anything else that this world might decide to send at the boy from the cupboard under the stairs. The boy from the cupboard was gone. The artificer of Hogwarts had things to build. Chapter 3, The Compass Knows Christmas at Hogwarts was quieter than Harry had expected, and he meant that as a compliment. The castle with most of its students gone had a different quality, less a school and more something older, something that breathed differently when it wasn't performing. Corridors that were normally shoulder to shoulder with students became long and echoing and full of amber afternoon light that slanted through high windows and caught the dust and made everything look like a painting of itself. The enchanted ceiling in the great hall cycled through proper winter skies, heavy gray, sudden blue, the deep velvet dark of clear December nights scattered with more stars than any London child could imagine. Ron had stayed. His parents had written with a warmth that apparently radiated off the parchment itself, and a package arrived on Christmas morning with 7 Weasley jumpers in it, 6 with letters, 1 in green with a small golden H on the front that had been made for someone they'd never met, which was the kind of thing the Weasley family apparently did without thinking about it. Harry held it for a longer moment than he would admit to. He put it on and wore it all day. Hermione had gone home to her parents, but she'd left him 3 books from the library, technically borrowed, which was a fine distinction, with specific pages marked and marginal notes in her precise handwriting. The notes said things like this might be relevant to the channel work you described, and see also page 340, the discussion of intent locking is interesting and I think the author is wrong about this, but read it anyway. He read them all on Christmas afternoon while Ron played chess against himself and occasionally narrated the game with increasing dramatic investment. The forge was content. That was the word for it. Like a fire that had been properly fueled and left to do its work. Harry used the break to think. He had the gauntlet. He had the truth disc. He had the sketch of the compass, which the forge had been pushing at the edges of his awareness since November, not urgently but with the steady insistence of something that knew it was needed. He also had, arranging themselves in his mind like a hand of cards laid on a table, several things that required the compass specifically. Quirrell. The 3rd floor corridor. And Dumbledore. That last one was the most complicated. He'd been watching the headmaster the way you watch something that is very good at being watched. Dumbledore was spectacular at being observed. He performed warmth and wisdom and benign authority with the fluency of someone who had done it for so long it had become second nature. He stopped to talk to students by name. He had a remark for every occasion that landed like a wry grandfather rather than a command. He made you feel, in his presence, that everything was being handled. The truth disc had gone cold in his presence exactly once, at Christmas dinner, when Dumbledore had said to the small gathering of remaining students, Harry, Ron, several others, Hogwarts takes care of its own. You're all perfectly safe here. Not a dramatic cold. Not the ice water quality it had for Quirrell. More like a partially opened window in winter. The statement wasn't exactly a lie, Dumbledore probably believed most of it. But there was something at the edge of it, something omitted, something shaped around rather than addressed. Harry thought, he knows something about me that he isn't saying. He thought, most adults know things about me they aren't saying. This one is careful about it. He thought, the compass. The materials for the compass of true sight were, objectively, the most difficult he'd yet attempted. He needed the forged stone iron frame, that much he could make, had made before. He needed a central disk of lunocrystal, which was a mineral that formed only in areas of prolonged magical convergence and was, technically, available commercially but at prices that made the Borwick and Fell shop look like a market stall. He needed silver wire more refined than standard jeweler's silver, the pamphlet specified moon-drawn silver, wire that had been drawn in stages under specific lunar conditions. And he needed, for the runic ink that would fill the channels, a combination of ingredients that included powdered starstone, his own blood in a precisely small quantity, and something called verolite, which Elspeth described simply as the light of a true thing, captured. He'd puzzled over the last one for 2 weeks. What did that mean in practical terms? The forge, when he pressed it, gave him an image, sunlight through clear water. A candle in an honest hand. Something genuine, burning. He wrote to Hermione about it on the 27th. She wrote back on the 29th with 4 pages of analysis and the suggestion, at the end, that verolite might be produced by a strong, genuine lumos cast by someone who had absolute clarity of intention in the moment of casting, no performance, no effort, just pure intent lighting a wand. Harry had tried it that night, alone in the dormitory, and held his wand tip over a small clear veil he'd transfigured from a button. He thought of nothing except light. Not the word, not the motion, not the performance of doing it correctly. Just the thing itself, light, simple, real, here. The lumos that came from his wand was different from every lumos he'd produced in class. It was the same brightness but with a quality he couldn't name, and when he held the vial to it and felt the warmth press into the glass, the vial held that quality afterward. He'd labeled it carefully and put it with his materials. 2 things remained. The lunocrystal he solved through Hagrid, specifically through Hagrid's extraordinary network of what he called contacts, and everyone else would call magical creature traders who trusted Hagrid because Hagrid trusted them back completely. The moon-drawn silver arrived via owl in late January, wrapped in dark cloth, sent from a shop in Edinburgh that apparently existed for exactly this kind of purpose and asked no questions. The blood was simple. A small cut from a pin, a single press of his index finger against the prepared channel before sealing. The forge was very specific, not more than necessary. It binds, it doesn't fuel. He made the compass in February, over 3 consecutive nights. The frame was first, forged stone iron poured into the schist mold he'd refined for this purpose, the rune channels inscribed in 7 stages that corresponded to the 7 functions Elspeth had laid out: see past surface, see past word, see past shape, see past intentions mask, see the structure beneath, see the thing itself, see the thing as it truly is. Each stage was a deeper level of revelation. The final rune, the thing as it truly is, was the hardest he'd ever worked. It took 4 hours on the 3rd night, his hands shaking by the end, the forge burning so steady and hard in his chest that he was warm despite the February cold coming off the windows. When the final rune locked, the compass gave off no sound. Instead, for one long moment, the air in the dormitory changed, became very clear, very still, like air after lightning, and Harry felt something open in his perception, a new channel, and then close again when the compass settled. He picked it up. It fit in his palm like the truth disc, but heavier, more complex, the lunocrystal disc in the center catching the firelight and not quite reflecting it correctly, angling it, refracting it through some internal geometry that wasn't optical. He held it up and looked through the lunocrystal disc at the dormitory around him. The world didn't change. But it clarified. He could see, faintly, at the edges, the runes in the walls that encouraged sleep. He could see the aging reparo work in Ron's bedpost where it had cracked. He could see Neville's school trunk and the small protective charm someone, his grandmother, probably, had put on it with so much love that it registered as warm even through the disc. He could see his own reflection in the window and see, quite clearly, the forge burning in his chest, a golden light that was utterly invisible without the compass but was, through it, as obvious as a lantern in a dark room. He lowered the compass. He thought, all right. Now I go look at Quirrell. He didn't go alone. He'd made that decision consciously. Not because he needed protection, the gauntlet was on his right hand and the forge was burning clear and steady, but because doing things alone when you didn't have to was a pride decision, not a smart one, and Elspeth's pamphlet had a line about that he'd read often enough that it sat in his permanent memory. The artificer who isolates their craft from human relationship will eventually make things that serve no one, including themselves. He told Ron and Hermione at breakfast. Hermione said she was coming. Ron said obviously. Neither of them asked if they could. They went on a Tuesday afternoon when Quirrell had no classes and Harry had tracked, through a week's patient observation, that the man took a walk to the third-floor corridor at approximately 2 o'clock every other day. Harry didn't know why, he had a theory, but he wanted to see it first. They positioned themselves in an alcove on the third-floor corridor behind a large stone figure of a medieval wizard that provided enough cover for 3 students who weren't very large. Harry had the compass in his left hand. Gauntlet on his right. The truth disc on its cord. Ron had his wand out and the expression he got when he was genuinely alert, which was different from his normal face in small but reliable ways. Hermione had 3 books in her bag and her wand in her hand and was breathing with the controlled steadiness of someone who was frightened and had decided to be useful instead. Quirrell came up the stairs at 2:15. From the alcove, through the lunacris disc, Harry watched him. Without the compass, Quirrell looked like a nervous professor with a turban and a slight limp and the general aspect of someone who'd been startled too many times. With the compass, he looked like 2 things at once, the shape of a man, and underneath it, around it, layered through it the way veins layer through a leaf, something else entirely. Something dark and rooted and immensely old, coiled at the back of Quirrell's head where the turban sat, extending tendrils of influence into the man's nervous system, his magic, his intent. Not a passenger. More like a parasite that had graduated to partnership. Harry watched Quirrell approach the new door at the end of the corridor. Through the compass he could see the wards on the door clearly now, not just the presence of them but the structure, 6 layers of protection, the outermost 2 standard Hogwarts issue, the next 3 more complex and personal to their casters, and the innermost one. He went very still. The innermost ward was mirrorwork. He'd read about it in Principia Fabricandi. A ward that reflected back the deepest desire of whoever pushed against it, used it, tried to pass through it. It was elegant and ancient and the sort of thing that required not just magical skill but a specific philosophical understanding of how desire interacted with magic. Through the compass, the mirror ward glowed with the particular signature of the person who'd cast it. He knew that signature, he'd been watching it at the head of the Great Hall all year. Dumbledore's magic. On the door. On whatever was behind it. Quirrell stood before the door and Harry watched what was under the turban press against those wards with a cold, methodical testing, not breaking, not forcing, just examining the lock the way a locksmith examines it from outside, patient and technical. Looking for the flaw. Then Quirrell straightened, glanced once up and down the corridor, his eyes passed directly over the alcove without seeing them, which was partly luck and partly the small concealment rune Harry had etched into the stone floor of the alcove on their way in, and went back the way he'd come. Harry lowered the compass. Ron said, very quietly, "What did you see?" "Voldemort," Harry said, equally quietly. "Or the remains of him, anyway. In the turban." He looked at the door. "And something behind there that Dumbledore put protections on." Hermione made a soft sound. "The Philosopher's Stone," she breathed. Both boys looked at her. "Nicholas Flamel," she said, with the tone of someone who'd been waiting for permission to share information. "I've been researching since you told us about the corridor. Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. It produces the elixir of life. It could make Voldemort, what's in the turban, capable of returning to full power." Harry looked at the door. He thought about the 6 layers of protection. He thought about Quirrell testing the lock every other Tuesday like a job. "He'll figure it out eventually," Harry said. "The wards aren't infinite." "So what do we do?" Ron said. "We know what we know," Harry said. "The question is what to do with it." He pocketed the compass. And who to tell? The answer to that, he thought, was the most complicated part. He went to see Dumbledore. Alone. On a Thursday. He knocked on the stone gargoyle at the base of the spiral staircase and said the password, "Sherbet Lemon," which a fourth-year Hufflepuff girl had mentioned once in passing and which Harry had logged on the grounds that useful information was always useful, and went up. Dumbledore's office was circular and warm and full of silver instruments that spun and whirred with the busyness of very sophisticated enchanted objects, and the Sorting Hat sat on a shelf and appeared to nap, and Fawkes the Phoenix was real and extraordinary and turned one orange eye toward Harry with the particular intelligence of very long-lived things as he came through the door. Dumbledore sat behind the desk and smiled with genuine warmth that was also, unmistakably, the performance of genuine warmth by someone very good at it. "Harry," he said. "What a pleasant surprise. Sit down." "Lemon drop?" "No thank you," Harry said, sitting. He had the compass in his left hand in his robe's pocket, and his right hand rested on his knee, the gauntlet absent. He decided not to wear it for this, because wearing it would tell Dumbledore more than he wanted to tell him yet. "You wanted to see me," Dumbledore said, pleasantly. As if Harry dropping in to see the headmaster was the most natural thing in the world. "I know about the Philosopher's Stone," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. Something moved across the old man's face, not surprise, he was too good for visible surprise, but a recalibration. A reassessment. The kind a chess player makes when a piece moves unexpectedly. "Do you?" he said. "Flammel," Harry said. "It's behind the third-floor corridor. You've warded it with 6 layers of protection including a mirror ward on the innermost layer." A pause. "The mirror ward is particularly clever." Dumbledore was very still. "How do you know that, Harry?" Harry looked at him directly. "I'm observant." Another recalibration. Harry watched it happen. The old man was working through where the information had come from, Harry's magical ability, the possibility of help from older students, whether there'd been a breach in security. He was not, Harry noted, asking why Harry had been looking. "The stone is safe," Dumbledore said finally, and the truth disk, warm against Harry's chest, went cool. "Not ice water. But not still. Is it?" Harry said. "The protections are being tested." Harry kept his voice entirely level. "Every other Tuesday. By someone who has very good reason to want what's behind that door." Now something changed in Dumbledore's face. Not alarm, this man didn't do visible alarm, but a deepening. A focusing. "Who?" he said. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said. "And his passenger." The office was very quiet. Fawkes shifted on his perch. One of the silver instruments made a small sound and went still. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long, measuring moment. Harry looked back and did not blink and did not offer anything further, because he'd said what he'd come to say and the rest depended on what Dumbledore did with it. "Harry," Dumbledore said, gently and with great care, "this is a matter best left to the faculty to." "I'm not asking for permission," Harry said. "Or instructions. I'm telling you what I know because you run this school and you should have accurate information." A beat. "I'd also like to know why you moved the stone to Hogwarts specifically. Whether that was intentional. As an invitation." The silence that followed was long enough to have furniture. Dumbledore's blue eyes were doing something complex and unreadable. He looked at Harry the way you look at something you'd been expecting to be one size and found was considerably larger. "You are," he said finally, very quietly, "quite unlike what I expected, Harry." "I get that a lot," Harry said. "The stone is here because this is the safest place in Britain," Dumbledore said, and the truth disk went neither warm nor cold, which meant it was the truth as Dumbledore understood it, even if Harry suspected the reasons behind why it was true were more complicated. "There's a mirror behind that door," Harry said. "The erased mirror?" A flicker. "Barely there." "Yes. You put it there so that whoever gets through the final ward will see the stone but not be able to take it. Unless they want it purely for someone else's benefit." Harry worked through this as he said it, the forge turning it over in the back of his mind with the clarity it always brought to structural problems. The final trap is the mirror itself. The stone appears to someone who wants it but doesn't want to use it. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long time. 11 years old, the old man said softly, to himself more than Harry. "Almost 12, Harry said. "Harry." Dumbledore leaned forward slightly. "I want you to promise me that you will not go near the third-floor corridor." Harry met his eyes. "I'll be careful," he said, which was not a promise and they both knew it. He stood, nodded, and left the office. On the spiral staircase going down, he pressed his hand against the compass through his robe and thought, "He knows I'm different. He doesn't know how. He's watching me the way he watches things he thinks he'll need later." The forge was steady and untroubled. Harry filed it away and went to find Ron and Hermione. What he told them, over the remains of dinner in the near-empty Great Hall, was most of it. The stone. The mirror. Dumbledore's careful evasions. He left out one part, the sense, persistent and precise, that Dumbledore had a specific plan that involved Harry specifically, and that Harry being at Hogwarts wasn't purely because of magic or education or coincidence. He wasn't sure about that part yet. He needed more. "He didn't try to stop you?" Ron said. "He asked me to promise not to go near the corridor." "And you didn't?" "I told him I'd be careful." Ron grinned. Hermione did not grin but a corner of her mouth moved. "The mirror of erased," she said. "It shows you your deepest desire. If someone gets past the protections and reaches the mirror, Quirrell would see Voldemort restored," Harry said. "Which means he can't get the stone from it. The design is clever. Voldemort wants the stone for himself. So Voldemort is stuck," Ron said. "For now," Harry said. "But Quirrell keeps testing the wards. He's patient and he's not stupid." He leaned back in his chair. "And I think Dumbledore knows this, and I think," he stopped. "What?" Hermione said. "I think," Harry said slowly, "that Dumbledore is waiting for me to go after the stone myself. As a test. Or as a solution." He looked at them. "I think that's the plan. Let Harry find out. Let Harry go in. Harry's desire is to protect people, not to use the stone, so the mirror gives him the stone, because his desire aligns with the function. He retrieves it, Voldemort is stopped, and nothing is revealed about how Harry found out or what he's capable of." The silence had a particular quality. "That's," Ron said, and then stopped. "Elaborate," Hermione finished. She looked troubled. "And it means he was always going to put you in that position." "Yes," Harry said. "And Ron looked at him carefully. "You're not angry?" Harry considered this honestly. "I'm curious," he said finally. "He's very good. He's also wrong about a few things. The main one being that I don't need to run his plan to get the same outcome." "What do you mean?" Hermione said. Harry looked at them both. He looked at the high table, empty now, at the headmaster's chair. "I mean," he said, "that I'm going to go into the corridor on my own terms, at a time I choose, and I'm going to come back with whatever is necessary to protect that stone properly. Not because Dumbledore planned it. Because it needs to be done." Ron leaned forward. "When?" "Not yet," Harry said. "There are things I need to finish first." He put his hand on the table. "There's a design the forge has been working through. Something I can put on the stone's chamber that makes the mirror ward redundant. A permanent anchor rune, something that fixes the stone to its location categorically. Quirrell can find it but he can't move it, ever, regardless of what he wants. Hermione stared at him. You can do that? I think so, he said. I need another month. A month, Ron said. Right. We can work with a month. March arrived in the way March does, reluctant, cold, with brief suggestions of something warmer underneath, like a fire seen through a keyhole. The castle felt different from February. The light changed. Students began planning Easter breaks with the energy of people who'd been cooped up too long. Harry spent March building. The anchor rune was the most conceptually complex thing he'd yet attempted. It wasn't an artifact, it was a rune set pressed directly into the stone architecture of the castle itself, which meant two things. First, it had to be compatible with Hogwarts' own deep runic structure, the ancient layered craft in the walls, and second, once placed, it would be there permanently. No taking it back. He spent 2 weeks making sure he had it right. He cross-referenced with Elspeth's pamphlet, with Principia Fabricandi, with 3 additional texts Hermione sourced through an increasingly creative campaign of library research that technically didn't cross any rules but did involve asking Madame Pants questions that danced around the edges of several. He tested the anchor concept on a small stone, a chip of Hogwarts flagstone he'd taken from a crumbling section of the courtyard, pressing a minor version of the rune into it and then testing it with every dislocation charm he knew and several Ron helped him find in an advanced charms book. The stone didn't move. He amplified the dislocation charms. Still nothing. He tried a combination of 3 charms at once, which Hermione watched with an expression of academic fascination barely covering something closer to alarm. Still nothing. It works, she said quietly. For a chip of flagstone, Harry said. The real question is scale. You're going to press it into the stone's chamber directly. Into the floor and walls of the chamber. A circuit. He spread out his design sketch. These 4 runes form the corners. The connecting lines run through the stone itself. If I do it right, the stone becomes part of the circuit, not moved to a new location, just included in the anchor field. Hermione studied the design for a long time. Then, the runic grammar here, between the 3rd and 4th anchor points. Do you see how the channel wants to redirect outward rather than complete the circuit? He looked where she was pointing. She was right. He adjusted it on the sketch, redirecting the channel inward with a small binding glyph, and the forge gave a precise pulse of yes. Good catch, he said. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who has been useful in exactly the way they wanted to be. What do I do while you're in there? You and Ron keep watch. 2 hours. If Quirrell moves early, he won't, Ron said from his spot on Harry's bed, where he'd been lying upside down staring at the ceiling, apparently thinking. He had a session on Tuesday. He won't go back till next Tuesday. It's like clockwork. Still, Harry said. Still, Ron agreed, sitting up. We'll watch. They went on a Thursday night in late March, when the castle was quiet and the moon was behind clouds and the 3rd-floor corridor was empty in both directions. Harry wore the gauntlet. The compass was in his left hand. The truth disc on its cord. His holly wand in his wand pocket. The door opened at his touch, not the ward collapsing, but the ward recognizing something. He felt it. The forge felt it. Whatever Dumbledore had built into these protections, something in them resonated with what Harry carried. He filed that away. The first chamber. A harp played over a sleeping 3-headed dog of such size that the word enormous felt like an understatement, Hagrid's work, unmistakably. The dog slept. Harry kept very still and walked past it with a care that was respectful rather than frightened, because he'd learned the difference. The second chamber. Devil's Snare, which Hermione had told him about because she'd been thinking about it since he mentioned the corridor in November and had mapped the school's underground magical plant chambers during a spare period because Hermione was Hermione. He held the gauntlet up and thought light, warmth, the particular heat of a summer afternoon and let the ward field carry that quality outward. The devil's snare withdrew. The third chamber. A flying key. He looked at it once, dismissed the broomstick, wouldn't need it, and held the compass up and scanned the swarm until the lunachrist found the runic signature of the correct one through the confusion of motion. He reached out his hand. The key, inexplicably and then explicably, flew directly into his palm. The forge. The right kind of call, the right kind of intent. The key turned in the lock. Chess. Giant chess. Ron would have wept with envy. Harry studied the board for 4 seconds, long enough, and moved pieces with precise intent, never touching one twice, the path to the opposite end unfolding like a solved equation. Then fire. 2 walls of it, black and purple. Hermione had written him the logic puzzle from memory after spending an afternoon in the corridor in November with her ear to the door being deeply peculiar about it, which he loved about her. The smallest bottle. He drank it and went through the black flame. The mirror of Eriste stood in a chamber of dark stone with the Philosopher's Stone somewhere at its center, the mirror ward active and glowing through the compass like a second sun. Harry looked at the mirror once. He saw himself. Just himself, older, standing at a workbench with things spread before him in the warm light of something he'd built, and on his face an expression that wasn't triumph, wasn't relief, was just the deep satisfaction of someone who spent their days doing exactly what they were made to do. He looked away from the mirror. He knelt on the floor. It took 45 minutes. He pressed each of the 4 anchor runes into the stone floor with his bare right hand, no wand for this required direct contact, the forge flowing through his palm into the structure of the castle itself. It was the hardest thing he'd done. Not painful, but immense, like pressing your hand against something that was also pressing back, something with 4 centuries of accumulated magic that had to recognize him before it would accept what he was adding to it. The 3rd rune was where it nearly didn't work. He could feel the castle's deep magic pushing back against the new inscription, not with hostility but with the resistance of something settled in its own patterns, and he didn't force it. He waited. Let the forge speak to it, warmth to warmth, old magic to old magic, builder to built, and slowly, very slowly, the resistance shifted to acceptance. The 4th rune snapped into place with a crack he felt rather than heard, a shockwave through the stone that radiated outward in a perfect circle from where he knelt and came back again, completing the circuit. The 4 anchor points connected. The connecting lines ran through the floor. The chamber sang, very quietly, at a frequency below hearing. Harry stood. His legs ached. His hands were warm. The Philosopher's Stone, which he hadn't touched and hadn't needed to, was now anchored to this spot with a permanence that made the mirror ward look like a suggestion. Even if Quirrell broke through every other protection. Even if Voldemort returned to full power. Even if the mirror was moved or destroyed. The stone was fixed. He looked at the mirror once more before leaving. His reflection looked back at him, older and content, and raised one hand in something that was almost a wave. Harry smiled, turned, and went back the way he'd come. He found Ron and Hermione in the alcove, and their expressions when they saw him walk out of the door upright and calm were 2 different kinds of relief. Hermione's was controlled and immediate. Ron's was a full-body thing. "That's it?" Ron said. "That's it," Harry said. "You were in there 45 minutes, Hermione said. The 3rd anchor rune needed time." She looked at his hands, both of them, palm up, which she'd asked to examine. The right hand had a faint pattern pressed into the skin at the base of his fingers. Not a burn. More like something that had gone very deep and left a mark at the surface. She pressed her fingertips against it. "Does it hurt?" "No. It's warm." She held his hand for a moment longer than necessary to examine it, then put it down carefully. "The stone can't be moved. Not by anyone, ever. Not even Dumbledore." Ron made a sound of involuntary awe. Hermione pressed her lips together against what was also clearly awe but felt the need to audit it first. "That's technically illegal," she said. Placing permanent runic modifications on a school building without authorization is, very necessary, Harry said pleasantly. Very necessary, she agreed, with no actual argument. They walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the dark, three abreast in the wide corridor, the castle quiet around them and the moon coming out from behind the clouds and sending light through the high windows in long pale bars across the stone floor. Somewhere below them, the philosopher's stone sat in its chamber, anchored forever. Somewhere in the castle, in his locked office, Quirinus Quirrell sat with something at the back of his skull that had been patient for years, and would now, very soon, run out of patience entirely. And in the headmaster's office, Harry was relatively sure, an old man with half-moon glasses was sitting at his desk and feeling, with a precision he wouldn't have admitted, that the board had just shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. Good, Harry thought. Let him recalibrate. He and Ron and Hermione reached the fat lady, gave the password, climbed through the portrait hole into the warm bustle of the common room that still had people in it even at this hour, Fred and George playing exploding Snap in the corner, a handful of fourth years over a game of chess, and Harry dropped into his usual chair by the fire. The forge settled. Warm. Satisfied. Already beginning, at the very back of his awareness, to sketch the shape of something new. Harry stretched his hands toward the fire and felt the anchor's warmth in his right palm, permanent now, a reminder pressed into his own skin of something he'd built and left behind. He thought about the mirror. About what he'd seen in it. About the workbench, and the warm light, and the expression on his own face. He thought, yeah. That sounds right. And the fire crackled and the castle breathed around him and his two best friends came and sat either side of him, Ron talking already about something Percy had done, Hermione half listening and half reading, and Harry closed his eyes and rested and let himself simply be here, in this place, at the beginning of what was going to be a very interesting life. Chapter 4, Threads of Fire. Summer at the Dursleys was a different animal after Hogwarts. Harry had expected that. What he hadn't expected was how clearly he'd see it now, the smallness of Privet Drive, not physically, but in the sense of how much of reality it refused to acknowledge. The neat hedges and the identical front doors and the careful performance of normalcy that everyone on the street had agreed to maintain, collectively and without ever discussing it. It was a kind of magic, he thought. Just a very dull kind. Uncle Vernon had looked at him when he stepped off the platform with the careful suspicion of someone who'd had a year to remember what Harry could do and had spent that year deciding to forget it. Aunt Petunia had made a remark about hair. Dudley had looked at him the way Dudley always looked at him, with the default contempt of someone who needed a target, and then looked again, because something had changed and Dudley's instincts, however unrefined, were not entirely absent. Harry had simply gone upstairs, unpacked, and started working. He wrote to Ron and Hermione every week. He worked on designs. He refined his understanding of the rune language, which was expanding the way language does when you're living inside it, new grammatical structures revealing themselves through use, through error, through the forge suggesting and Harry interpreting and the resulting artifact either working or teaching him why it didn't. He heard about Quirrell in a letter from Hermione in late June. Quirrell had resigned, or been asked to resign, or simply not returned, the details were unclear, and the defense against dark arts position was open again. Whatever had ridden inside him had apparently departed when the stone proved permanently inaccessible, abandoning Quirrell like a coat that no longer served its purpose. Quirrell was reportedly in St. Mungo's. Harry read that part twice and felt something complicated that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite satisfaction and lived somewhere between the two. He'd secured the stone. He'd ended the immediate threat. He had not, however, ended anything larger, and he knew it. The forge knew it too. It had been building towards something all summer, a pressure that wasn't anxiety but was purposeful, the way creative urgency feels different from worry. It showed him fragments. Dark fabric. Moving runes. Something that caught light and didn't return it the same way it arrived. By mid-July he had a sketch. The forge-bound cloak. The letters from the Weasleys started in August. First Ron, breezy and news-heavy and full of Quidditch observations, Ron had spent the summer with a Quidditch camp catalog in Charlie's old broomstick and the specific joy of someone spending their free time on exactly what they loved. Then a letter that had two handwriting styles, which took Harry a moment to decode, the Weasley twins, Fred and George, who had apparently decided Harry deserved to be welcomed into their confidence about a scheme involving a portable swamp, the details of which Harry read with enormous appreciation. Then, on August 20th, a letter with Dumbledore's writing on the outside. Harry held it for a moment before opening it. The truth disc sat on his desk, warm and still in the summer morning light. Dumbledore's letter was brief. It said that the new school year would bring some changes to the faculty, noted that he hoped Harry had had a restful summer, and in the second-to-last paragraph, mentioned, with the casualness of someone burying a headline, that there had been reports of concerning activity near several Muggle areas and that the school would be taking additional precautions. The last line said, "I find myself curious, Harry, about how your independent studies are progressing." Harry read that line 3 times. The truth disc was still warm, Dumbledore wasn't lying. But the question had the quality of something said to prompt an answer, to measure what came back. He wrote back, "Very well, Professor. I hope the summer has been productive for you too." He sealed it and sent it with Hedwig and went back to his design notebook. The forge-bound cloak design took most of August to finalize, and it was the most technically ambitious thing he'd attempted yet. He had the invisibility cloak, his father's, given to him anonymously through Dumbledore at Christmas first year. He'd examined it thoroughly since then with the compass, and what it showed him was extraordinary. The cloak wasn't enchanted in the normal sense. It was woven from something called Death Shadow silk, a material that existed in exactly one known sample in all of recorded magical history, and its properties went deeper than any enchantment laid on top could go. It predated the forge's own ancestral line. It was very, very old. He wasn't going to modify it. He wouldn't have dreamed of it. The forge-bound cloak was a different garment entirely, his own, built from scratch. It wouldn't be invisible. It would do something more interesting. The material was shadow thread, which he'd spent July researching and August sourcing through a shop in Knockturn Alley that he'd written to with a letter precise enough that the owner had responded, surprised but professional, with a price and a delivery time. Shadow thread was woven from the processed fiber of shadow silk moths, rare, expensive, and possessing the interesting property that it could hold runic inscription in its weave the way normal cloth could hold a dye. The inscription became part of the fabric structure rather than sitting on its surface. He'd spent his savings. It was worth it. The frame of the cloak, cut from measurements he'd taken of himself with a slightly modified Muggle tape measure, was his first attempt at material work at this scale. Not a palm-sized disc or a hand-fitting gauntlet. Actual fabric, a full-length cloak, the kind with a hood and deep fall that he'd been measured for at Madame Malkin's what felt like a very long time ago. He pressed the first runes into the shadow thread in the last week of August, working in the evenings when the Dursleys had retreated to the TV and the house was quiet. Each rune required a different needle, he'd had to make them himself from the last of his forged stone iron, small and precise, shaped so they could carry the rune intention through the eye of the needle into the thread when he guided them through. Hermione, he thought, would either be fascinated or horrified by what he was doing with needlework. Probably both. The runes were in 3 layers. The first layer, pressed into the inner face of the cloak, was the warding layer, expansion of the ward field function he built into the gauntlet, but distributed across the entire surface of the fabric, making the cloak itself a shield that moved with him. The second layer, woven into the middle of the thread, was the concealment layer, not invisibility, but something subtler and more sophisticated, a filter on perception that made the eyes slide past him the way eyes slide past things that seem unremarkable. Not invisible. Just uninteresting to attention. Third layer, on the outer face, the resonance layer. It would vibrate at the frequency of ambient magic around him, when in an area of high magical activity, the cloak would attune, making him harder to detect by magical means. The forge had a name for the combination of all 3. It offered it as an impression rather than a word, presence that fits the room. He finished it at 2 in the morning on September 1st, the last rune seated with a sound like a held breath released, and the cloak settled around his shoulders with a warmth that the gauntlet's warmth had taught him to recognize as rightness. He put it on. Looked in the mirror of his room. He could see himself clearly. He looked the same. But there was a quality about the reflection, something about the way the cloak fell, the way the shadow silk moved, that made him look like someone who belonged wherever they happened to be. Not a threat. Not a curiosity. Just completely, convincingly there. He took it off, folded it carefully, packed it in his trunk. The forge blazed with the pleasure of a completed thing. He slept 4 hours and woke up and got on the night bus to King's Cross and felt, for the first time, properly ready for his second year. The school year started the way second years start when you've been through a first year, with the relief of things being familiar, followed immediately by the discovery of which familiar things were about to become complicated. The new Defense Against Dark Arts professor was Gilderoy Lockhart, who Harry encountered for the first time in Flourish and Blots during Diagon Alley shopping when the man had grabbed him for a photo opportunity with the unsolicited enthusiasm of someone who treated other people as props. Harry had extracted himself politely, which Lockhart had taken as charming modesty, because Lockhart appeared incapable of reading rooms that weren't reflecting his own performance back at him. Hermione was, and Harry thought this with great affection and zero judgment, briefly dazzled. She owned all of Lockhart's books. She quoted them over breakfast in the first week with an earnestness that Ron found genuinely painful. Harry simply waited, because Hermione's intellectual standards were very high and the books were very thin, and the gap between those two things would close on its own schedule. It closed in the third week of September, during a defense lesson in which Lockhart released a cage of Cornish pixies and then failed to contain any of them with a charm he'd apparently misremembered, and Hermione caught 11 of them with a precisely cast immobulus while Lockhart hid behind his desk. She walked out of that lesson with an expression that had moved through betrayal and arrived at clinical assessment, and at dinner said, without preamble, his books are fabricated. All of them? Ron said. The core events are real, she said. He interviewed the actual people who accomplished the things he's described, then modified their memories. The accomplishments are his in name only. She put her fork down. He's a very good memory charm practitioner, actually. That's the only genuinely impressive thing about him. Harry watched Lockhart at the high table, flashing teeth at McGonagall, who was managing to look both polite and deeply unimpressed. How does he keep getting away with it? Because people want to believe it, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who had learned something uncomfortable about human nature and was metabolizing it honestly. The forge, warm in Harry's chest, agreed. And added something. Harry turned his attention inward for a moment. The forge wasn't pointing at Lockhart as a threat. Lockhart was window dressing. The forge was pointing at the year itself, at the quality of what was coming, and what was coming had a dark and ancient flavor, something stone-cold and old and patient. Something that had been waiting. He started wearing the forge-bound cloak to class within the first week. The first whisper came in October. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. It appeared on a wall near the library, written in something that was almost certainly not paint, beside the petrified form of Mrs. Norris who had been found hanging from a torch bracket by her tail. Filch found her. Harry, Ron and Hermione had been coming back from nearly headless Nick's death day party and found Filch finding her, which was, objectively, very bad timing. Snape had looked at Harry in that moment with eyes that did complicated things. Harry had looked back and let Snape look, because there was nothing to find. The truth disc in his pocket confirmed Snape's allegation that they'd been up to something was not something Snape believed. The man was performing an accusation for structural reasons, not because he thought it was true. That was, in its own way, interesting information about Severus Snape that Harry filed for later. He went to the library. The Chamber of Secrets, per the 300-year-old accounts he located in 2 evenings of research, was Salazar Slytherin's hidden chamber somewhere in the depths of Hogwarts, and it contained a monster. The monster petrified, or killed, depending on the victim, and it had been opened before, 50 years ago, at a cost that was written around rather than directly in the historical records, which meant someone had expunged the central details. Hermione, reading the same accounts, looked up and said, "The common element in all the petrifications is the method. None of the victims look like they encountered whatever this is directly. The cat was hanging from a bracket. The ghost of a headless knight, ghosts can't be killed, so he was only petrified. The method is indirect. Something reflective." Harry held the compass up and scanned the page he was reading. Through the lunachrist, the text gained a clarity it didn't have to the naked eye, and a word surfaced from the 3-century-old script, basilisk. He lowered the compass. "Basilisk," he said. Ron went slightly pale. Hermione's face moved through 3 things fast. "Of course," she said, almost to herself. "The indirect sighting. Reflective surfaces. The petrification rather than death when it's indirect, you'd only die if you met its gaze directly." She gripped her quill. "A basilisk can live for hundreds of years. Salazar Slytherin put one in the chamber. Someone opened it 50 years ago, and someone's opened it again," Harry said. "The question is who?" He looked at the compass. He'd used it in the corridors twice this week already, scanning. Whatever was moving through the castle moved through the walls, which meant it knew the passages, the hidden structure, the old channels between stone and stone. He'd seen traces of something through the lunachrist. Not the creature itself. Something that guided it. A signal, very faint and very old, threaded through the castle's stonework in a way that had no business being there, separate from Hogwarts' own ancient runework, added to it. He thought, something in the castle is commanding it. He thought, what could survive 50 years inside the castle without anyone knowing? He said to Hermione, carefully, "You said someone expunged the records from 50 years ago. The central details, yes. Is there any way to find out who was blamed? Who was expelled?" She looked at him. "Expulsion records go back several centuries. They're in the headmaster's office, technically. Or they might be in the administrative archive, which is," she paused. "Which is accessible to prefects." They both looked at Ron. "I'm not a prefect," Ron said. "No," Harry said. "But Percy is." Percy, it turned out, didn't need to be manipulated or deceived. He simply needed to be asked by someone who framed the request in sufficiently academic terms, and Percy Weasley responded to academic framing like a compass responds to north. Harry did the asking himself, walking up to Percy in the common room on a Tuesday evening with Hermione's 3 most academically phrased sentences ready, and came away 20 minutes later with the information that 50 years ago a student named Rubeus Hagrid had been expelled for allegedly keeping a monster in the castle. Harry sat with that for a day. The forge was quiet during the sitting. Then he went to see Hagrid. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione where he was going, which he'd feel bad about later, but this felt like something that needed to be a one-person conversation. He knocked on the door of the hut in the early evening, let himself in when Hagrid called gruffly that it was open, and sat down across from the largest, warmest, most genuinely good-hearted person he'd met in this world and said, gently, "I know you were expelled. I know it was connected to the chamber." Hagrid went very still. His enormous hands wrapped around his mug. "Harry, I don't think you opened it," Harry said. "I'm not here for that. I'm here because whatever monster you were supposed to have let loose, I think it's out again, and I think you might know something about what's in the chamber that could help." Hagrid looked at him for a long time with eyes that were large and damp and holding about 9 different emotions. Then he said, very quietly, "It weren't Aragog. I want you to know that. My Aragog never hurt no one in this school. They blamed him because they needed someone to blame." "I know," Harry said. And through the truth disk, warm and completely still, he did. "The monster in the chamber, I don't know what it is," Hagrid said. "Honest. I never saw it. In my time, 50 years ago, I knew it weren't Aragog but I couldn't prove it. Dumbledore believed me. Professors believed me. But the Ministry wanted it settled. Who opened it 50 years ago? Harry said. Hagrid's big hands tightened around the mug. I don't know, he said, and the disc went neither warm nor cold, which meant, truth, but not the whole truth. Not a lie, genuinely partial knowledge. Harry noted that and left it, because pressing Hagrid felt wrong in a way that his instincts trusted. He thanked him and walked back to the castle in the autumn dark and stood outside for a moment, looking up at the towers. The forge was active and pointed, directing his attention not outward but downward, through the ground, through the castle's deep foundations, towards something that was very far below where he stood. He pressed his boot against the flagstone path. The anchor rune, the permanent mark on his right palm, still warm, resonated faintly. The castle's deep magic answering. Whatever was down there, the castle knew it was there too. Had always known. And hadn't been able to stop it. He thought, so I will. It took him until February to find the entrance. He found it with the compass, tracing the command signal he'd first identified in October through the castle's stonework, week by week, narrowing its source the way you triangulate a sound by moving toward it. The signal ran through the second-floor girls' bathroom, specifically through the pipes, specifically through a pipe beneath a sink with a small snake carved into the tap. He stood in the bathroom on a Tuesday in mid-February, having checked it was empty first, and held the compass up and looked at the carved snake on the tap, and the forge blazed. He could hear it. Faintly. Very far below. Something immense moving through stone passages, patient and purposeful, and beneath its movement a thread of something that was not quite a voice but was instruction, cold and deliberate and coming not from below but from beside him, from his school bag, specifically from the small black diary he'd picked up in the corridor 2 weeks ago when it fell from a first-year girl's bag and she'd gone pale when she noticed it and then looked oddly relieved when Harry picked it up and returned it to her. He'd been carrying it since then because the forge had said, "Don't give it back." Not yet. And through the compass, looking at his own bag now, the diary glowed with a dark and specific light that had nothing academic about it. He opened his bag and took out the diary. T.M. Riddle. 50 years old. The forge said nothing. It simply burned, clear and still. Harry took out the compass and looked at the diary through the lunacris disc. What he saw made him stand very still for several seconds. The diary wasn't a diary. It was a Horcrux, though he didn't have that word yet, wouldn't encounter that specific term for several more years. What he saw through the compass was a structure inside the object, a runic architecture of extraordinary and terrible craft, a soul fragment bound to parchment with magic that required death to perform. He could see the rune chains that held the fragment in place. He could see the fragment itself, dim and malevolent, pressed into the diary's structure like a dark core. And he could see, because the compass showed the structure of things, that the fragment was capable of projection. Of speaking. Of influencing anyone who wrote in the diary, establishing contact, gaining trust, ultimately directing them toward the chamber. He looked at the diary for a long time. Ginny Weasley. The first year. The girl who'd looked relieved when the diary left her hands. He'd been carrying it for 2 weeks and she'd been, what had she been? More herself. Less pale. Less afraid. He put the diary in his bag and went back to the common room and found Ginny in the corner by the window, reading with the restored concentration of someone whose head had been cleared, and sat down nearby and said, quite carefully, "How are you feeling?" She looked up, startled. She had Ron's coloring and her mother's directness and the particular wariness of someone who'd been through something and hadn't told anyone. "Fine," she said. "Good," Harry said, and the disc was warm. She believed it, at least. "You've seemed better this week." "Have I?" Something moved across her face. "You seemed worried about something. Before." He kept his voice easy, no pressure, just observation. Ginny put her book down and looked at him with eyes that were weighing something. Then, "It's going to sound mad. Madder than a school full of magic." A brief, real smile. "I had a diary. I'd been writing in it since September. And it wrote back, she stopped. What did it say? It told me things. Things about the school. About the chamber. Her voice went quiet. I don't remember some things from the past few months. Big pieces. Like I was, somewhere else and someone else was using my. She stopped again, hard this time. Harry looked at her steadily. The diary is gone, he said. I have it. It won't write to anyone else. Her face did something complicated and enormous. You, how did you know? It's what I do, he said, simply. Then, none of what happened was your fault. Something was using you. You didn't let it in, it found a way in. He paused. You should tell your mum. She'll think I was stupid. She'll think you were 11 and encountered something very old and very calculated. He looked at her steadily. That's not the same thing. Ginny looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, small and decisive. He went back to his own table, took out the diary, and set it on the desk. The forge showed him what he needed. Destroying a Horcrux, still without the name for it, working from pure structural analysis, required, the forge explained in its impression language, one of two things, basilisk venom, which destroyed the soul fragment absolutely, or something that could unpick the runic architecture holding the fragment in place, which was more delicate and more permanent, because a fragment freed from its anchor without being destroyed left traces. He couldn't get basilisk venom without the basilisk. He could, however, do something the forge had a very specific design for, a rune array, pressed into the pages of the diary from the outside, that would collapse the internal structure. It took 3 sessions and a night. The runes had to be worked in reverse order to the binding. He had to read the structure first, map it through the compass, then systematically dismantle it from the outside layer inward. The soul fragment, as the outer layers fell, became agitated. He could feel it through the warmth of the forge, something cold and furious pressing against the walls of its prison, and it tried, in the last hour, to project directly at him. A cold voice at the edge of his thoughts, young and old at once, full of old fury. Harry pressed the final rune in and the diary's spine cracked and the darkness inside it made a sound that wasn't physical and came apart. He sat back. His hands were shaking slightly, not from pain but from the sustained precision. The diary was a charred ruin. He picked it up. Went to see Dumbledore. The headmaster's office was the same as before, warm, spinning instruments, Fawkes. Dumbledore looked at the ruined diary Harry placed on his desk and was quiet for a very long time. He picked it up. He turned it. He set it down. Then he looked at Harry and said nothing for a further, very deliberate moment, and then, "Where did you get this?" "Ginny Weasley had it," Harry said. "She's been writing in it since September." It was directing her, toward the chamber. The basilisk followed her instruction, even if she didn't know she was giving it. He paused. The diary contained a fragment of Tom Riddle's soul, sir. Bound by a runic construction I've disassembled. Whatever was inside it is gone. Dumbledore's eyes were very blue and very still. You disassembled it? Yes. Without assistance. I had the compass. The compass, Dumbledore said slowly. Which you built? Yes. The old man looked at him over his half-moon glasses with an expression Harry was learning to read. This one said, I am comprehensively recalculating. And underneath that, harder to see but there, something that wasn't quite worry and wasn't quite awe and lived somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between them. The basilisk? Dumbledore said. Still in the chamber, Harry said. It needs to be dealt with. I'll send word to, I'll handle it, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. I'll go in, Harry said. I know where the entrance is. I know what to expect. I have what I need. He paused. And sir, the diary. It won't be the only one. There will be more like it. Objects like that. Made the same way. He watched the old man's face carefully. "I think you know that." A very long silence. Fawkes ruffled his feathers. "Yes," Dumbledore said, quietly. "I do know that." "Then we should talk about it. After the chamber." He left the office, and behind him, he was fairly certain that Dumbledore sat for quite a long time in a room full of spinning instruments and thought hard about exactly how much of his plan was still intact. He went down alone. The forge-bound cloak was around his shoulders, all 3 rune layers active for the first time simultaneously: ward field, perception filter, resonance attunement. The gauntlet on his right hand. The compass in his left. His holly wand in his pocket. The basilisk was enormous and ancient and terrible, and it was also, through the compass, looking sideways at it rather than at its eyes, something that had been enslaved to a dead man's purpose for 50 years and was not, in any meaningful sense, evil. It was a creature following an instruction that no longer had a legitimate source. He spoke to it. Not in Parseltongue, he wasn't a Parselmouth, and he didn't need to be. He used the forge. He pressed his right hand against the cold stone of the chamber floor and let the forge speak in the language of old and built things, the language of intent, the same language he'd used to communicate with the castle's deep magic. The basilisk stilled. Its massive head came around, toward the sound of something ancient addressing it in terms it could understand. Harry said, through the forge, through the stone, in the language of intent rather than word, "The command is broken. The diary is gone. You are not bound anymore." The basilisk was still for a long time. Then it lay its head down on the chamber floor and something in its massive coiled body went slack, not death, not sleep, but the release of something that had been held under tension for 5 decades. Harry stepped back. Looked at the ceiling. The chamber was not what he'd expected. It was old, yes, but it was also beautiful in the specific way that very well-built things are beautiful: the columns, the carved stone, the craftsmanship of someone who had loved his work even when his ideology was rotten. Salazar Slytherin had been a builder. Harry felt that and felt complicated about it. He pressed a single rune into the chamber entrance, a sealing rune that would hold the entrance closed from the castle side, prevent accidental re-entry, and climbed back up. He was muddy. His hands were still warm. The forge was blazing with the pleasure of something resolved. He walked back to the Gryffindor Tower and found Ron and Hermione in the common room, and they both looked at him with expressions that moved from relief to fury to relief again in quick succession, and then Ron said, "You went without us," and Harry said, "I needed to and I'm sorry," and Hermione said, "That's not an apology, that's a statement," and Harry said, "I know, I'm sorry," and then Ron hugged him in the abrupt, uncomplicated way Ron did things, and Hermione put a book down very hard on the table as her version of the same sentiment, and that was that. The forge-bound cloak was folded in his bag, warm and whole. The chamber was sealed. The diary fragment was ash. Ginny Weasley was safe. And Tom Riddle, Harry now knew with the precision of someone who had looked at the structure of the thing directly, had made more than one anchor for himself in the world. More than one object carrying that same dark architecture, that same rune-bound fragment. He would need to find them. He would need, eventually, to take them all apart. He sat by the fire in the common room and took out his notebook and turned to a new page, and at the top of it wrote, in small neat letters, what he made. And how to unmake it. The forge burned warm and purposeful at the center of him. There was work to do. There was always work to do. He picked up his quill and began. Chapter 5. The Song the Wand Remembers. Third year arrived with 2 pieces of news that hit Harry in quick succession, like stones thrown at different speeds from different directions. The first was Sirius Black. The name came to him over the summer the way news comes when you live in a muggle house with no access to the wizarding world's proper channels, fragmented, sideways, through the cracks. Uncle Vernon had the television on in the sitting room while Harry was passing through on his way to the kitchen, and the newsreader said escaped prisoner and considered extremely dangerous and Sirius Black, and Harry stopped in the doorway because the name did something. Not recognition exactly, he didn't know the name consciously. But the forge responded to it. A single pulse, warm and specific, the way it responded to things that mattered. He wrote to Ron and Hermione that evening. Hermione wrote back with 3 pages. The condensed version: Sirius Black was a convicted mass murderer, the first person to ever escape Azkaban, and was considered Voldemort's most loyal follower, the man who allegedly betrayed Harry's parents. The man who'd given Voldemort the Potter's location. Harry sat with that for a long time. The disc, in his hand, said nothing, there was no statement being made for it to evaluate. Just information sitting in his chest alongside the forge's steady heat. He turned it over carefully, the way you turn something fragile. This man helped kill my parents. The second piece of news arrived a week later, in a letter from Dumbledore. Brief and courteous as always. This year, Hogwarts would host Dementors at its perimeter, ministry requirement in connection with the Black Manhunt. Harry should be aware that Dementors affected sensitive magical individuals more acutely, and if he found their presence difficult he should feel free to. Harry put the letter down before he finished that sentence. He found something about the framing irritating in a way he couldn't immediately articulate, and then he could. Dumbledore was offering him permission to struggle. Harry filed that away and went back to his workbench. The summer's project was already half finished. The forge had started showing it to him in April, during the aftermath of the chamber, fragments of design, suggestions of form, building gradually into something clear. He'd understood the purpose first and the structure second, which was a reversal of his usual process, and he'd spent May and June working out why that was. The purpose was this: a wand that was entirely his. Not the holly wand, which was his, absolutely, and he'd carry it always, but something different. Something built rather than found. The holly wand had chosen him through Ollivander's centuries of craft and its own phoenix feather core's particular resonance. The song-steel wand would be his because he made it, every grain and every rune, from nothing to finished thing. His intent, his magic, his craft, poured into a tool that no wand maker in the world would recognize and no existing theory would fully explain. He'd read everything about wand lore he could find. Ollivander's own texts, published and the less published ones Hermione had sourced with the determined creativity she brought to research she cared about. Gregorovitch. The Eastern traditions of wandcraft that were considerably older than English wand lore and considerably less rigid in their assumptions. What he understood was this: a wand was a conduit. It shaped and channeled magical output the way a lens shaped light. The quality of the conduit determined the quality of what came through it. And the relationship between a wand and its wizard was bidirectional. The wand learned the wizard as much as the wizard learned the wand. A forged stone wand would be categorically different. Not a conduit in the traditional sense, more like an extension. The magic wouldn't pass through it, it would live in it, the way it lived in his artifacts, woven through the structure rather than channeled across the surface. The core was the central problem. All wands used a magical substance, phoenix feather, dragon heartstring, unicorn hair, that served as the resonant element, the thing that interfaced between wizard and wood. His wand needed a core that would interface between himself and the forged stone, specifically, something that could speak both languages. The forge showed him, in mid-July, what it should be. One single impression, clear as a bell, something that was part of you, freely given. He'd thought about that for 2 days. Then he understood it. Not blood, he'd used blood in the compass and it served a binding function, not a resonant one. Not hair, not bone, nothing physical. Something that was part of him in a different sense. He'd sat at his desk with his hands on the workbench and let the forge burn as clearly as he could manage, and then he'd taken his holly wand and cast a single spell, just lumos, plain and simple, and as the light came from the tip he'd pressed an empty sliver of forged stone against the wand's tip and held it in the light. The forge had done the rest. What transferred into the sliver was not light. It was a resonance, the specific magical signature of Harry Potter at the moment of honest, unperformed intention. His magic recognizing itself and agreeing to be held. He'd sealed the sliver. That was the core. The body of the wand was forged stone worked to a different texture than the gauntlet, not plate-like but rod-like, slim and balanced, the material composition adjusted for flexibility at the runic level rather than rigidity. He'd spent 3 weeks getting the balance right, the way it sat in his hand, the way the weight distributed from heel to tip. He'd scrapped 2 versions. The third felt correct the moment he held it. The rune work on the body was the last thing and the longest. 17 runes in total, arranged in a spiral from handle to tip, each one describing a different aspect of the wand's function: carries, channels, amplifies, speaks truly, holds intent, releases cleanly, remembers, grows, chooses with the hand that holds it. The last rune, at the tip, was one he'd developed himself, no precedent in Elspeth's pamphlet or any text he'd found. The forge had given it to him specifically and only, a rune that meant something close to becomes what is needed. He pressed it into the tip on the last night of August at midnight, and the song-steel wand sang. That was the only word for what it did, a pure tone, not loud, more felt than heard, running up through his fingers and along his arm and into his chest where the forge caught it and answered back. Then it was still and warm in his hand, 15 inches, tapered, dark as old iron with a faint pattern in its surface that moved like water when the light hit it right. He cast lumos. The light that came from the song-steel wand's tip was identical in brightness to what came from the holly wand. But its quality was different. It was his light, specifically, the same quality as the verilight he'd captured for the compass but constant rather than momentary. And the spell had cost him nothing. No effort, no friction. The magic had moved from him to the wand the way water moves downhill, not because it was forced, because it was simply where it wanted to go. He kept the holly wand. He would always keep the holly wand. But the song-steel wand went into a fitted case he'd made from a strip of runic schist and the last of his shadow thread, and he packed it carefully, and on September 1st he boarded the Hogwarts Express with 2 wands and felt, for the first time, comprehensively armed. The Dementors were worse than Dumbledore's letter had implied. Harry had expected something unpleasant. What he got, when the train stopped outside Hogsmeade and the door opened and one of them came in, tall, hooded, moving with the particular wrongness of something that didn't operate by normal physical rules, was something categorically different from anything he'd prepared for. Cold first. Then darkness. Not the absence of light but the presence of something that ate warmth from the inside out, that reached into the chest and found the worst thing there and turned toward it. He heard his mother's voice. Clear as a telephone call, clear as a recording, "Not Harry, please, not Harry," and then a high, cold laugh that he'd never consciously heard but knew with his whole nervous system. Then the cold broke. Not because he fought it off. Because the forge blazed to life in his chest with a heat so absolute and so immediate that the Dementor's cold had nowhere to live. It was like a furnace door thrown open. The forge didn't push the darkness away, it simply burned so completely that there was no room in his chest for anything that cold. Harry opened his eyes. The Dementor was retreating. Across the compartment, Ron and Hermione were pale and shaken. A new professor, sandy-haired, shabby robes, a face that had lines in it like someone who'd been tired for a long time but remained fundamentally decent, was producing a bar of chocolate from a torn bag and pressing pieces into shaking hands. Professor Lupin, Harry remembered from the staff announcement in Dumbledore's September letter. Lupin gave Harry a piece of chocolate and then looked at him with a slight tilting of the head, the expression of someone who had been watching closely and noticed something interesting. "You recovered quickly," Lupin said quietly, while Ron and Hermione ate their chocolate. "I had some help," Harry said, equally quiet. Lupin looked at him for a moment with intelligent grey eyes. Then he nodded, accepting it without pressing, which Harry immediately liked about him. "Eat the chocolate anyway," he said. "It helps regardless." Harry ate the chocolate. The forge settled back to its resting warmth, satisfied and untroubled. He thought about his mother's voice for a long time that night in the dormitory. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione about that part. Some things he needed to sit with first. Lupin's defense against the dark arts lessons were, without question, the best teaching Harry had encountered in 2 years of magical education. The man taught the way he thought, sideways, through example, through engagement, never talking at students when he could involve them in the thing itself. The boggart lesson in the first month became immediately legendary: the wardrobe, the laughter, Neville facing his boggart in the shape of Snape wearing his grandmother's clothes, the room full of real if slightly hysterical learning. Harry hadn't faced the boggart, Lupin had intercepted, smoothly, before Harry reached the front, and Harry had accepted this without comment because he could see that Lupin was worried about what might come out of that wardrobe and he wasn't sure yet if he agreed with the concern. After class he stayed behind, which Lupin expected. The man was already reorganizing the wardrobe's lock with a precise charm, not looking at Harry, his voice carrying easily across the empty room. "I thought it might turn into Voldemort." "I thought so too," Harry said. "But I think it would actually turn into a Dementor." Lupin looked at him then. "Because of what happened on the train. The Dementor made me hear something. My mother." He said it cleanly, without drama. "I didn't expect that. I'd like to be able to defend against them better." Lupin set the charm and turned fully toward him. "The Patronus charm," he said. "Yes. Will you teach me?" A pause, and in the pause something moved across Lupin's face, not reluctance but consideration, and Harry suspected he was being assessed in the specific way that someone assesses whether an unusual thing will work, not whether they want to help. "The Patronus is extraordinarily advanced magic," Lupin said. "Third-year students don't. I know what it requires," Harry said. "A powerful happy memory. Sufficient intent. And holding that intent clearly enough under pressure that the cold doesn't break it." He paused. "I know something about sustaining intent under pressure." Lupin looked at him with that slight head tilt again, the one that meant "I'm noticing something I haven't categorized yet." "Who are you, Harry Potter?" he said, and it was a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. Harry considered it. "Still working that out," he said honestly. "But I'd like to start with the Patronus if you're willing." Lupin was willing. They practiced in an empty classroom on Tuesday evenings. Lupin brought a real Dementor for the third session, something he secured through a contact at the ministry with what Harry gathered was a carefully worded request, and Harry faced it with the Songsteel wand for the first time. The difference was immediate and substantial. The Dementor's cold came in. The memory of his mother's voice came with it. But the Songsteel wand, in his hand, was warm, not counteracting the cold, just present, just his, the resonance of his own magic steady in his grip, and he held on to it the way you hold something real when the dark tries to make you doubt reality. He thought of the forge. Specifically of the night of his birthday in the cupboard, when the golden light had filled his palm for the first time. The warmth of it. The fact of it. Something real and his. Expecto Patronum. The Patronus that came from the Songsteel wand was not a thin silver wisp. It was full and formed from the first attempt, a stag, enormous and bright, exactly as bright as the verilight he'd captured for the compass, the same quality of genuine thing. It hit the Dementor at full force and the Dementor fled. Lupin sat down on the edge of a desk and looked at the place the stag had been. "Your father," he said, very quietly. His Patronus was a stag. Harry looked at where it had stood. He hadn't known that. He held the Songsteel wand and felt its warmth and thought about a man he'd never consciously met who had apparently shared this particular shape of warmth in his magic. "You knew him," Harry said. "Very well." Lupin's voice had a specific quality that Harry recognized, controlled feeling, the voice of someone who has long practiced holding grief in a functional shape. "James Potter was one of the finest wizards I've known." He paused. "One of the best men." Harry sat down across from him. The classroom was quiet except for the sound of a distant owl. "And Sirius Black," he said. Lupin's face changed. Something went carefully, precisely still. "What about him?" "You knew him too," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Did he betray my parents?" The stillness in Lupin's face became something more complex. Harry held the truth disc in his left hand, not hidden, just present. Lupin noticed it and looked at it with the expression of someone who had just been handed a piece of a puzzle they didn't know they were assembling. "What is that?" Lupin said. "Something I made. It tells me when someone's lying." He kept his voice conversational. "I'm not trying to use it against you. I'm telling you I have it because I want you to know I'll know if you're being straight with me." Lupin looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his own hands. "No," he said. "I don't believe he betrayed them. I haven't for a long time. But the evidence, what evidence exists actually? His guilt was assumed. He was found at the scene. Peter Pettigrew was assumed dead. He went to Azkaban without a trial." "Without a trial," Harry repeated. "Without a trial," Lupin said, "and the disc was warm and still." Harry sat with that. In his chest the forge was the precise, focused warmth it had when something important required attention. He looked at Lupin and thought about what he was seeing. A man who had believed in Sirius Black's guilt, stopped believing it without being able to say when or why, and had been carrying that private revision alone for years. "Peter Pettigrew," Harry said. "If he isn't dead, he's a registered animagus," Lupin said, and something in his voice had changed. "Become more precise." "A rat." "A rat," Harry said. They looked at each other. "Ron has a rat," Harry said slowly. "He's had it since he started Hogwarts. His brothers had it before him. The Weasleys have had a pet rat for 12 years. Lupin stood up from the desk. The problem was proving it. They couldn't simply accuse Ron's rat, Scabbers, wizen and old and missing a toe, the specific kind of unremarkable that in retrospect was a perfectly calibrated performance of unremarkable, without more than a theory. Lupin could force the transformation, but forcing an animagus to transform required either the animagus's cooperation or a specific charm that Lupin said he could perform but which would, legally, need witnesses. Harry thought about it for a week. Then he went to Ron. He did it on a Saturday evening in the dormitory while the other boys were at dinner. Ron was reading a Quidditch magazine and Scabbers was asleep on the pillow, and Harry came in and sat down and said, "Ron, I need to tell you something about Scabbers and it's going to sound insane but I need you to hear it." Ron put the magazine down. His face did the thing it did when he was preparing to listen seriously to something. "All right," he said. Harry told him everything. Pettigrew. The Animagus Registry. The missing toe, which was how an animagus concealed themselves from detection, a small physical difference between their human and animal form. The 12-year timeline. He laid it out clearly, the whole structure of it, and let Ron sit with it. Ron sat with it for a long time. He looked at Scabbers, asleep on the pillow, twitching faintly in whatever dream rats have. "He's been in my bed," Ron said quietly. "Yes. In my hands. All through school." "Yes." Ron's face moved through something that was mostly fury but had other things woven through it, betrayal, the specific ugliness of something you trusted being something else, the retroactive nausea of proximity to a thing that had worn innocence as a disguise. He breathed through it. "Then, what do we do?" "I need your help," Harry said. "We need to force the transformation and we need witnesses. Lupin, ideally, and Hermione. And we need to do it where Pettigrew can't run." "When?" "I want to set it up properly." Harry paused. "And I want to make something first." Ron looked at the workbench in the corner. "For catching him. For making sure he can't escape once we have him." The Cage of Fixed Truth was not on Harry's list of intended projects. The forge produced the design in 3 days, which meant it considered it urgent, a small enclosure, palm-sized when collapsed, that expanded to cage size when deployed, its bars made from forged stone iron inscribed with anchor runes of the same type he'd used on the Philosopher's Stone chamber. Anything inside the cage could not apparate, could not transform, could not use magic to pass through or remove the bars. It was simply fixed. He made it in 4 days. The anchor runes at this smaller scale were easier than the chamber floor had been but required more precision per rune because the surface area was smaller and the margin for error correspondingly tighter. Hermione timed him without comment and brought him tea twice and read a book about ancient containment magic that she was cross-referencing against his design, occasionally saying things like, the fourth bar, the channel direction, and Harry would adjust without breaking concentration. On the fourth night, when the cage collapsed to palm size and sat in his hand with the warmth of a finished thing, Hermione said, "This could hold a dark wizard indefinitely." "That's the idea," Harry said. "You built something in 4 days that Azkaban does in theory and not very well in practice." She looked at the cage. "Harry. You know that what you can do is, you understand it's extraordinary, right? Not in a, I'm not trying to flatter you. I mean in a technical, objective sense. The scope of what you're building, at 13, Elspeth Cavendish built a ward system at 12 that's still functional in Edinburgh Castle," Harry said. "I know. I found her in the records." A pause. "She also died before she finished what she was working on." Harry looked at Hermione. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'll be careful," he said. "That's not a promise either," she said. "I've noticed you don't make promises about your safety." "I make promises I can keep," he said. She pressed her lips together. Then she put the book in her bag and said, "Right. Tuesday. Lupin. The dormitory. Where nobody can run." "Tuesday," he agreed. Tuesday came with rain against the windows and a quality of taut anticipation that Harry had learned to recognize as the feeling of things reaching their resolution. He gathered them in the dormitory after dinner, Ron, Hermione, Lupin, who came with his wand and the gravity of someone who had been carrying something for 12 years and knew the weight of it was about to either double or halve. Scabbers was in Ron's coat pocket, which was where he'd been all day. Ron had kept him close, which had required the specific acting ability of someone who loves a thing being asked to hold it without revealing he knows it's rotten. Ron was better at that than Harry would have predicted, actually. Harry had the cage in his left hand, collapsed. The song-steel wand in his right. "Lupin," Harry said. "Whenever you're ready." Lupin cast the Animagus Revelation charm. It hit Scabbers and the rat twitched and went rigid, and then the transformation happened in reverse, not the clean, practiced reverse of someone choosing to transform, but the forced unwinding of a held shape, skin rippling, bones extending, a sound that was deeply unpleasant, and then there was a small, bald, watery-eyed man on Ron's bed where Scabbers had been. Peter Pettigrew screamed. Harry deployed the cage in one motion, the forged stone bars expanding around Pettigrew before the scream finished, the anchor runes blazing with warm gold light, and Pettigrew hit the bars and bounced back with the shocked expression of someone who had relied on escape his entire life and found it categorically unavailable. He tried to disapparate. Nothing. He raised a hand for a spell. The cage dampened it, the magic dispersed against the bars without cohering. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. "Peter Pettigrew," Harry said. "You betrayed my parents." Pettigrew opened his mouth. The truth disc in Harry's breast pocket was already cold. "No, no, you don't understand, I had no choice, he who must not, he was everywhere, he was in everything, I couldn't." "Stop," Harry said, very quietly. Pettigrew stopped. "You had a choice," Harry said. "You made it. I'm not going to argue that with you right now, because it doesn't matter what you say. What matters is what you did." He looked at Lupin. "He needs to go to the ministry. Not Azkaban, ministry, for a proper trial. Sirius Black deserves a proper trial too." Lupin was looking at Pettigrew with an expression that was doing enormous work trying to stay on the correct side of several instincts. He nodded, once, tightly. "I'll send word to Dumbledore," Hermione said. "I'll go now," Lupin said, hand on the cage's handle. Harry had built a handle, naturally, because good design was practical. He paused and looked at Harry. "Your father would have," he stopped. "Tried again. He would have been proud of this. Harry thought about the stag Patronus. About what it felt like when his mother's voice came from the dark and the forge answered it with heat. "I know," he said. And he did. Sirius Black came to Hogwarts 3 days later. Not escaping, not attacking, arriving, in Ministry custody, for a hearing that Dumbledore had evidently arranged with the speed of someone who knew every button to press in every Ministry department and which order to press them in. Pettigrew's existence was the fulcrum that moved everything. Harry didn't attend the hearing. He wasn't asked to and he didn't ask to attend. He sent a written account of events through Dumbledore, precise and factual, and spent that Thursday afternoon in the courtyard watching rain collect in the flagstone grooves and thinking about things. Hermione found him. She sat beside him without preamble, getting her robes damp, and said, "How do you feel?" "Strange," he said honestly. "I don't know Sirius Black. I don't know what he's like. But he spent 12 years in Azkaban for something he didn't do, because of a man who lived in a schoolboy's pocket. He turned the song-steel wand in his fingers. And my parents are still dead. Pettigrew being caught doesn't change that." "No," Hermione said. She didn't add anything to that and he was grateful. "I built the cage," Harry said. "I didn't build it for vengeance. I built it because Pettigrew needed to be held and a proper cage was the correct tool for that." He paused. "But I noticed, when he was inside it, that I wanted to do something to him. And I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't. Because it would have been wrong," Hermione said. "Because it would have been his kind of thinking. Using what you can do to punish what you can't forgive." He looked at the rain. "That's not what the forge is for." Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, "The wand. Can I see it?" He handed her the song-steel wand. She held it with both hands, carefully, and turned it the way she always turned things, with attention, with respect for the object. The runes caught what gray light there was and the dark iron surface showed its water pattern. "It's beautiful," she said, which she didn't say about things unless she meant it. "It works," Harry said, which was what he meant by beautiful. She gave it back. Sirius Black was acquitted on the Friday. The Wizengamot took 4 hours. Pettigrew, faced with Veritaserum and the Animagus revelation charm and 12 years' worth of accumulated evidence suddenly pointing in a different direction, had apparently confessed to everything with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting, on some level, for the possibility of confessing. Harry heard about it from Dumbledore's letter that arrived Saturday morning. Brief, as always. The case was resolved. Sirius Black was a free man. The Ministry had extended formal apologies. Dumbledore's letter had a postscript that Harry read 3 times. "There is a matter I have been meaning to discuss with you, Harry. Several matters, in fact. I find myself increasingly aware that the gap between what I have told you and what you have discovered for yourself is considerable, and that this gap does not serve either of us well. I would like to speak with you directly, before the end of term, about what I know of Tom Riddle's history, and what I believe is still required to end what he began. I think you may have already begun to piece together what I will tell you. I suspect, in fact, that you are ahead of me in several respects. I find that I am not entirely sorry about that." Harry folded the letter. The forge was very warm. A second letter arrived an hour later. Unfamiliar handwriting, large and slightly irregular, as if from someone who had written very rarely for a long time. It said, "Harry. My name is Sirius Black. I know you don't know me, not really. I knew your father from his first day at Hogwarts until his last day alive. I am your godfather, which means James and Lily trusted me with you. I did not deserve that trust, because I failed them when it mattered. I know there is nothing I can say about that. If you are willing to write back, I would like it very much. If you're not, I understand that too. Either way, you did something extraordinary this week, whatever exactly you did. Lupin has been deliberately vague with me, but I can read between the lines. James would have been absolutely insufferable about it, which I mean as a high compliment. Serious Harry read it twice. Then he picked up a quill. He sat for a moment, thinking about what to say to a man who was family without being known, who was grief and redemption and complicated history all at once. He wrote, "Sirius. I built a cage. It seemed like the right tool. I'll tell you about it if you're interested. I have a lot of things I've built, actually. I'd like to tell someone about them who knew my dad." He sealed it and gave it to Hedwig and watched her fly out the window and disappear into the grey Scottish morning. The forge was the particular warmth it got when something had been mended, or had begun to be mended, which was not the same as built but was its own kind of making. He met with Dumbledore that Sunday. The office. The instruments. Fawkes. The same blue eyes doing the same complex, careful things. But something was different this time. The old man's posture had changed fractionally. The specific straightness of someone who had been performing a role and had made a small adjustment in how they held themselves during the performance. Harry noticed it immediately. "Sit down, Harry," Dumbledore said. Harry sat. He had neither the gauntlet nor the song-steel wand in evidence. Just his holly wand in his robe pocket, the truth disc on its cord, and his full attention. Dumbledore told him about Horcruxes. He used the word, which Harry had been waiting for, the concept he'd understood from the diary but hadn't had the proper term for. Horcruxes, objects into which a fragment of soul was fixed through the act of murder, anchors against death, distributed pieces of a fractured self. Tom Riddle had made more than one. How many more was unclear. Dumbledore believed at least 6 total, which would have required 6 murders, 6 objects, 6 separate rune constructions of the kind Harry had already destroyed. Harry listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. When Dumbledore finished, he said, "You said, at least 6. Yes. Meaning you're not certain of the number?" "No. I have suspicions about specific objects. A locket. A cup. A ring. Possibly others." Dumbledore paused. "And a snake." Harry thought about a living Horcrux. The forge turned the problem over and offered a specific impression, complicated. The soul fragment inside a living thing was different from one inside an object. It could move, it could adapt, it couldn't be fixed. It would need a different approach. "What about me?" Harry said. Dumbledore went very still. "I've thought about it," Harry said, keeping his voice even. "The night Voldemort killed my parents. The killing curse rebounded. That kind of magical catastrophe, that much energy finding nowhere to go, something would have been displaced. Fragmented." He looked at the old man's still face. "And I've had the compass since February of first year. I've looked at myself through it many times. There's something in me that isn't the forge. Something I didn't put there." The silence was the longest one Dumbledore had ever offered him. "Yes," Dumbledore said finally. "I'm a Horcrux," Harry said. "An unintentional one. The 7th, though Riddle never intended 7. The old man's voice was very quiet. "I want you to know, Harry, that I have struggled with what this means. With what it would seem to require." Harry looked at him. "You thought I'd have to die. The fragment must be destroyed." "The fragment must be destroyed," Harry agreed. "Not me." He leaned forward slightly. "Sir, I have spent 3 years learning to unmake exactly this kind of construction. I took apart the diary. I understand the rune architecture of a Horcrux at a structural level better than anyone alive, possibly including Voldemort." He paused. "The fragment in me is connected to the scar. Which is connected to the curse. I can map it. I can work on it from the outside. It will take time and it will be the most difficult thing I've done. But I am not going to die so that a soul fragment doesn't have to be surgically removed." Dumbledore looked at him. His expression was doing something Harry had never seen from him before, moving towards something unguarded. "You've known," the old man said slowly, "for some time. I've suspected since first year, Harry said. I've known since I built the compass. And you've been working toward removing it. Preparing to. I need to understand more about the construction before I start. He paused. Which is why this conversation was necessary. Thank you for telling me. Dumbledore sat back. He looked old, suddenly, not performance old but genuinely old, carrying something heavy. I have not managed you well, he said quietly. You managed the war, Harry said, without judgment. That's different. It shouldn't be. No, Harry agreed. It shouldn't. They sat in the office for a while longer, Fawkes singing softly on his perch, a sound that was comfort more than music, warm and old. Then Harry stood to go, and at the door he paused and turned back. The Horcrux in me, he said. It's why the Dementors were worse for me than for other students, isn't it? There are two things in me for them to work on. Yes, Dumbledore said. I believe so. Harry nodded. Good to know, he said, and left. He was calm in the corridor. The forge was burning precisely and clearly in its resting state, untroubled by what he'd just heard, because the forge did not do useless fear. It did preparation. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower and found Ron and Hermione waiting, because Hermione had apparently told Ron that something was happening today and Ron had decided to simply sit in the common room until Harry showed up, which was Ron in its distilled form. Harry sat down with them and told them. He told them about the Horcruxes. About the objects. About the living one. About himself. He was precise and factual and quick, because the facts were what they were and dressing them differently would only make them heavier. Ron's face moved through several difficult things and arrived at an expression Harry had come to understand as Ron's anger, which was quieter than you'd expect and showed mainly in the jaw. We're going to fix it, he said. That's the plan, Harry said. All of it. The fragments. Every one. Yes. Including that one. Harry held up his right hand, where the anchor rune mark lived in his palm. I built something permanent in a chamber floor under pressure. I can work on something this close. A pause. It'll just take time. Hermione had her hands flat on the table and was breathing steadily and her eyes were bright. Right, she said. Then we're going to need to understand the rune architecture of each remaining object before we approach it. I'll start building a research framework tonight. She paused. All of it, Harry. We'll figure all of it out. I know, he said. The songsteel wand was warm in its case in his bag. The forge burned steady in his chest beside the small cold thing he'd been carrying since infancy without knowing it. He looked at his two best friends and thought about what Sirius had written. James would have been absolutely insufferable about it, and felt something large and warm and real. He had work to do. The hardest work yet. And for the first time, he had a complete picture of it, what it was, what it cost, what it required. He picked up a quill. He opened his notebook to the page that said what he made. And how to unmake it. He added to the list, a locket, a cup, a ring, a snake, a fragment carried in his own skin. Then he underlined the last entry. Put the quill down. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight I want to hear about Hermione's parents' holiday and Ron's Quidditch camp and whether the twins actually finished the portable swamp. Ron blinked. Seriously? Seriously, Harry said. The world is going to keep being complicated. That doesn't mean tonight has to be. Ron grinned, wide and real and entirely himself, and Hermione put down the notepad she'd already started and said, fine, with a warmth that made a liar of the word's brevity, and the fire crackled in the Gryffindor hearth and the rain ran down the windows and they talked until midnight about nothing that mattered strategically, which meant everything that mattered at all. Chapter 6, The Anchor Holds. The fourth year began with fire. Not metaphorically, literal fire, the kind that filled the sky over the Quidditch World Cup campsite with green light and a skull shape that people ran from, stumbling through the dark in half-dressed panic, their voices carrying the specific quality of real fear, which is nothing like performed fear and everything like animals understanding danger. Harry stood in the chaos with Ron on one side and Hermione on the other and watched the dark mark hang over the trees and felt the forge do something it had never done before, not blaze, not pulse, not direct. It went quiet. Not cold. Just absolutely, precisely still. The stillness of something that recognized what it was looking at. He looked at the mark and thought, this is it, then. This is the year it comes to a head. He looked at his hands. The anchor rune on his right palm caught the green light and threw it back warmer than it arrived. We should move, Hermione said, her voice steady with the quality of someone applying logic against the pressure of genuine fear. Yes, Harry said, and they moved. The Triwizard Tournament was announced at the start of term feast with the specific Dumbledore flair of making something ancient and dangerous sound exciting, which Harry thought the man did better than anyone alive. The Goblet of Fire. 3 champions, 1 per school. Eternal glory and 1,000 galleons. An age line around the goblet to prevent underage entry. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and listened and was already thinking about something else. The year before the feast he'd been working, all summer, through the chaos of the World Cup, in every spare hour, on 2 things simultaneously. The first was the Horcrux list. He'd mapped the remaining soul fragments through a combination of the compass's expanding sensitivity and the research framework Hermione had built with the thoroughness of someone who had treated it as her primary intellectual project for 12 months. They had, a locket confirmed in a Black family inventory. Sirius had sent him with a note that said this thing has always made the house feel wrong, I thought that was just the house, a cup confirmed in a Gringotts vault registered to the Lestrange family, a ring confirmed through cross-referencing Dumbledore's private notes, which Dumbledore had shared with him, openly now, the gap between them closed into something that functioned like partnership. A snake, living and moving, location unknown, and the fragment in his scar, which he'd been working on slowly and with tremendous care all year, mapping its runic architecture through the compass, learning its structure the way you learn a language, not by studying rules but by living with it. The second thing he'd been working on was the Anchor of Souls. The forge had started showing it to him in fragments from the previous spring. Not a physical object, not at first. More like a concept, a design principle, a thing that the forge wanted him to understand before it showed him the form. He'd spent months understanding it, and by August he'd understood this: the Anchor of Souls was not a weapon. It was not a trap. It was not a cage like the one that had held Pettigrew. It was something much older and more precise, a runic construction that worked on the fundamental architecture of fractured souls, that could, with enough power and enough intent, draw every fragment of a scattered soul toward a single point and hold them there in a configuration that prevented them from functioning independently. Not destruction. Binding. Permanent, non-lethal, total. Voldemort would live. He simply would not be Voldemort anymore in any sense that mattered. No Horcruxes to reach for. No distributed fragments sustaining him against death. One fractured soul, bound into the complete accounting of what it had done to itself, holding itself. The forge had needed all summer to show Harry why that was, and what it required, and what it would cost. He was still deciding about the cost part. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione about the cost part yet. The Goblet of Fire stood in the entrance hall under Dumbledore's age line, burning with a blue-white fire that was very old and entirely serious about its function. Students queued to submit their names. Fred and George, with the magnificent confidence of people who believed their own cleverness would solve any problem, had brewed an aging potion and submitted names and been ejected with long white beards, which Harry thought was the funniest thing that had happened at Hogwarts in 3 years. Harry did not submit his name. He had no interest in the tournament, not because he feared it, but because it was a distraction and he'd learned that distractions were expensive. He had larger things to build. On the night the goblet chose its champions, Harry sat in the Great Hall with 400 other students and applauded Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts and Victor Crumb for Durmstrang and Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons, and then the goblet threw out a fourth name in a tongue of fire and he registered, with neither surprise nor drama, that it was his. He walked to the front of the hall through 400 pairs of eyes with the forge burning steady in his chest and accepted the slip of parchment from Dumbledore's hand. He glanced up and met the old man's eyes, and Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that was asking, quietly, "Did you put your name in?" Harry's expression answered, clearly, "No. Someone else had." That was more interesting than the tournament itself. In the antechamber with the three champions and the various authority figures who were all talking at once, Harry stood quietly and turned over the question. Dumbledore eventually cleared the room to the three champions and their teachers, and when it was just Harry, he said, "Someone submitted your name." "Yes," Harry said. "Are you planning to compete?" Harry had thought about this. "I'll participate in whatever the tournament demands. But someone put my name in that cup for a reason that isn't about tournament glory, and that's what I'm actually interested in." Dumbledore looked at him with the expression Harry had been seeing more often this year, a particular kind of old respect. "You're safe enough in the first task," he said. "I'll tell you what I know. Dragons." "Thank you," Harry said. He meant it, and the disc was warm. He told Ron and Hermione about the fourth piece of information he'd been sitting on for a week that night in the common room. Not about the Anchor of Souls, not yet. But about what the forge had been showing him regarding the soul fragment in his scar. The mapping was complete. He knew its structure as well as he knew the rune grammar of anything he'd built. He knew where it anchored, how it connected, what would happen when it was removed. Hermione listened with her notebook open and her quill moving and then said, "When?" "Not yet. Removing it will announce something to Voldemort, there's a connection. When I remove it, he'll know immediately that something has happened, because he uses that connection too, he just doesn't know that I know he does." He paused. "The timing needs to be right." "Right how?" Ron said. "Right as in, everything else is in order first." He looked at his notebook, at the list. "I need the other Horcruxes dealt with before I touch the one in me. If I remove the scar fragment while the others are still whole, he just rebuilds. He has anchors to fall back on. So we need all of them," Hermione said. "Almost all. The snake I can deal with last, she'll be near him when he's resurrected, which is what tonight's name in the goblet is building toward. Someone is trying to deliver me to Voldemort at the end of this tournament. When that happens, I want to have the other Horcruxes already gone." He paused. "And I want to be ready with the anchor." Ron looked at him carefully. "This anchor thing. You've mentioned it twice now without explaining it." Harry had known this moment was coming. He met his friend's eyes. "I'll explain it when I've worked out the full cost," he said honestly. "Not to keep you out of it. Because I need to understand what I'm asking before I ask anything of you." Ron held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. "Simple as that." Hermione did not nod. She said, "The cost involves you, doesn't it?" It wasn't a question. Harry looked at her and said, "I'll tell you when I know." She put her quill down. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebook in front of her. Then she said, "All right," which from Hermione was a form of trust he didn't take lightly. The first task was dragons, and Harry faced a Hungarian horntail. He walked into the enclosure with the songsteel wand in his right hand and the forge-bound cloak around his shoulders and the gauntlet on his left hand. He'd reversed hands after last year, developing ambidexterity in his artifact use with the particular determination of someone who understood that flexibility was a tactical resource. The crowd in the stands was enormous and loud and then went very quiet when they saw him walk in without a broomstick. The horntail was magnificent. He didn't have time to fully appreciate that, but he noted it anyway, massive, armored, intelligent, currently furious and protecting a nest of eggs from a human being who had appeared in her territory for incomprehensible reasons. The dragon was doing exactly what a dragon should do. Harry had no personal grievance with her. He walked forward. Directly forward. Not toward the egg, toward the dragon. The crowd noise changed quality. The horntail breathed fire and Harry let the ward field expand from the gauntlet, the forge-bound cloaks 3 rune layers all running simultaneously, and the fire hit the ward and dispersed against it and rolled away and Harry kept walking. The dragon stared at him. He stopped 10 feet from her head. He held his wand down, not raised, not pointed. He let the forge speak through him the way he'd spoken to the basilisk, in the language of old and built things, intent rather than word, warmth toward warmth. Not I am not a threat. Not please or back down. More like, I see you. You are what you are. I am what I am. Neither of us needs to be harmed here. The horntail held her position for a long, charged moment. Her eyes, gold and vertical pupilled, older than any human institution he'd ever entered, assessed him with the completeness of something that operated on instinct sharpened by millions of years. Then she shifted. Not retreating. Turning. A deliberate, formal turning, the specific movement of something very large that has decided a thing is not worth its time, clearing a sightline to the golden egg in the nest. Harry walked past her, picked up the egg, and walked back out. The crowd noise came back in a wave that he felt more than heard, a physical thing, confused and enormous and then, as understanding settled, very loud. In the judge's box, he saw Dumbledore standing with an expression that was moving through several things. Beside him, Igor Karkaroff of Durmstrang looked annoyed in a way that told Harry precisely nothing useful yet. And beyond the judges, in the crowd, a pair of cold eyes that he registered through the forge's acute alert before his conscious mind caught up, a ministry official named Bartemius Crouch Sr., who was not looking at the dragon or the egg but directly at Harry with the specific attention of a man watching a plan run differently than he'd arranged it. Harry noted him. Kept walking. Between the first and second tasks he went hunting. Not dramatically, with precision. Sirius helped, from his place of free and considerable happiness at an address Harry knew and nobody at the ministry was ready to assign yet. Sirius had been inside the Black family house, which was enormous and full of dark objects and a portrait of his mother that screamed at everything, and he'd confirmed the locket's last known location, an island cave on the coast with a concealment charm that Sirius knew from old dark family rumor. Dumbledore confirmed it independently. They went on a Saturday in November, Harry and Dumbledore together, which was the first time they'd worked alongside each other directly and which had a quality Harry hadn't expected, 2 people who were both very good at what they did, working on the same problem in complementary ways without needing to negotiate it much. Dumbledore navigated the cave's outer defenses with the economy of someone who'd done this before in thought if not in practice. Harry dealt with the inferi in the cave's lake through the forge, not a spell, not fire, something older, a pulse of warmth through the water that told the dead things nothing living was here, and the dead things believed it, and they sank. The locket was in a basin filled with potion that Dumbledore had already begun to drink by the time Harry stopped him. "What are you doing?" Harry said. "The locket must be retrieved, the potion must be consumed to lower the level." "I know." He looked at the basin with the compass held up. The potion had a runic signature, it targeted memory and will, specifically, layered misery and despair into whoever consumed it. Dumbledore would be incapacitated. "I'll do it." "Harry, I have something it can't touch," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. Harry drank the potion. It was the worst thing he'd experienced. Worse than the Dementor on the train. Worse than finding out about the fragment in his scar. It hit memory directly, and what it found in his memory were 10 years in a cupboard, 10 years of being told he was nothing, 10 years of a world that had misplaced him, and it tried to use those things to hollow him out. The forge burned. Not counteracting. Not fighting. Just burning, the way it had always burned, steady and ancient and completely his, and the warmth it produced was not happiness, it was truth. The truth that those 10 years had produced this. Produced the gauntlet and the cloak and the compass and the cage and the song steel wand and the anchor. Produced someone who could stand in a cave full of dead things and drink a memory-destroying potion and stay standing because everything he was had been built from worse than this. He retrieved the locket. His hands were shaking. He handed it to Dumbledore and held out his other hand for the compass. The locket's sole fragment was identical in structure to the diaries, which he'd learned well. He pressed the disassembly rune array into the locket's surface right there in the cave, hands not entirely steady but precise enough, the forge running at full capacity, and the fragment came apart with the same non-sound as the diary, something felt rather than heard, a darkness briefly having edges and then not. Dumbledore held the locket afterward. It was just a locket now. Old gold, hinged, empty. You could have told me you'd already mapped the disassembly method, Dumbledore said. I didn't know if it would work on a different object, Harry said honestly. I needed to test it. You tested it on yourself. I test most things on myself, Harry said. It's simpler. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment in the wet dark of the cave. Then he said, very quietly, I owe you several apologies, Harry. For several different things. And I intend to give them properly at some point. You've been doing better, Harry said, which was true and the disc confirmed it. The cup came next, in December, through Dumbledore's contact inside Gringotts, a goblin named Ragnarok who had a long-standing grievance against the Lestranges and was willing, for a specific consideration that Dumbledore negotiated over 6 weeks, to allow an authorized inspection of the vault with a ministry-observed warrant. Harry went in with the compass while Dumbledore held the official warrant paperwork, and found the cup behind 4 levels of dark object concealment charms, and disassembled its fragment on the vault floor with Ragnarok watching with the expression of a goblin who had seen most things and was filing this under unusual but acceptable. 2 down. The ring he found through Dumbledore's own investigation, a gaunt family heirloom in a derelict cottage in Little Hangleton, which Dumbledore had located through a combination of family history research and the specific application of his own considerable skill. He went alone to retrieve it, and Harry was at Hogwarts when he came back. He knew something had happened immediately, because Dumbledore's right hand was blackened to the wrist with the specific dark magic corruption that an active Horcrux curse produces when someone handles the object incorrectly. Harry met him in the corridor outside the hospital wing. You touched it directly, Harry said. I did, Dumbledore said. He looked at his hand with the expression of someone confronting evidence of their own fallibility. Old habits. The curse is active in the tissue, Harry said. He took the compass out and scanned the hand. The corruption was runic at its base, not a spell exactly, more like a consequent structure built into the ring's architecture. The soul fragment was gone, Dumbledore had managed that, but the curse had transferred. How far has it spread? The healers believe. How far, Harry said, looking at the compass rather than at Dumbledore. To the wrist. Progressing. Harry lowered the compass and looked at the old man with directness. I can slow it. Possibly stop its progress. I'd need to work on your hand directly, the same runic disassembly, applied to the curse structure in the tissue rather than to a physical object. He paused. It won't be comfortable. Dumbledore looked at him. Something moved across his face, not the performance of emotion but the actual thing, old and tired and genuinely surprised. You do that? Of course I'd do that, Harry said, with slight impatience at the question's premise. Come on. He spent 3 hours on Dumbledore's hand in the hospital wing with Madame Pomfrey hovering at a distance that was both professionally necessary and personally uncomfortable, and the forge running carefully at a precision Harry had never applied to living tissue before, which required a fundamental adjustment in technique, softer, more incremental, more responsive to what the tissue told him back. The curse structure in the hand was old dark magic of a kind that predated standard runic work, which meant he had to feel its grammar rather than read it, to work by analogy rather than direct translation. He stopped the spread at the elbow by midnight. The blackening didn't reverse but it stopped moving. Dumbledore sat through the whole of it without complaint, which told Harry something about the old man's capacity for pain and also, more importantly, for stillness under someone else's care. I can't undo what's there, Harry said at the end. The damage is permanent. But it won't spread further. That is considerably better than the alternative, Dumbledore said. He looked at his hand. Then at Harry. How long until the fourth task? The third task, Harry corrected. There's no fourth. The Triwizard Tournament has 3. The third task, then, Dumbledore said. How long until it? June. And you believe the tournament has been corrupted? That someone is using it to deliver me to Voldemort, Harry said. Yes. I've believed it since October. The person who put my name in the goblet is still at Hogwarts, someone with enough access to the goblet and enough knowledge of its function to fool an age line. That's a short list. He paused. I'm working on narrowing it. Moody, Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him sharply. Or someone impersonating Moody, Dumbledore said quietly. I have had my suspicions since November. His behavior has been, he paused. He has been teaching dark arts more fluently than someone who fights dark wizards typically does. Harry thought about Bartemius Crouch Sr. watching him from the judge's box. Crouch has a son, he said. Bartemius Crouch Jr. Death Eater. Supposedly died in Azkaban. Dumbledore's expression said he was filing this alongside his own information and arriving at a conclusion. Polyjuice potion, he said. For 9 months, Harry said. He'd need a continuous supply of Moody's hair. And Moody would need to be somewhere, alive, accessible. He can't impersonate a dead man forever if the man was alive when he started. They looked at each other. I'll find Moody, Dumbledore said. You prepare for June. I've been preparing since September, Harry said. He told them about the anchor in April. He'd been working on it all year alongside everything else, the design, the materials, the understanding of what it required. By April he understood the cost completely and had sat with it long enough to know his own answer. He told Ron and Hermione in the dormitory, late, the castle very quiet around them. He laid it out from the beginning, what the Anchor of Souls was, what it would do, how it worked. Then he told them what it required from him. The anchor needed a focal point. Something that could draw every scattered fragment of Voldemort's soul simultaneously, all the remaining ones, the snake and the scar fragment, because the locket and cup and ring were already gone, and hold them in a bound configuration. To do that, the anchor's runic array needed to be anchored itself to something, and what it needed was a complete soul. Willing. Present in the same space. You, Hermione said. Her voice was very even. Me, Harry said. My soul is the focal point. The anchor holds itself on me and draws the fragments through the connection they already have with me, through the scar, through the resonance Voldemort created when he tried to kill me. All his fragments flow toward what they recognize as home. And then? Ron said. And then the anchor binds them. In him. He lives, but every fragment is recalled and bound. He cannot die without dying completely. He has no more anchors. He is, for the first time since he made his first Horcrux, genuinely mortal. Harry paused. And the fragment in me is drawn out with the rest. The scar is clean. No more connection. What does it cost you? Hermione said. The forge, Harry said. He met her eyes. The Anchor of Souls, at the scale required, to draw all of Voldemort's fragments simultaneously, needs everything I have. All of it. The mark, the forge, the crafting capacity. It goes into the anchor. After it's done, he paused. After, I'm just a wizard with a holly wand and a collection of things I've built that will still work because artifacts persist. The silence was enormous. Ron said, very quietly, just a wizard. With a rather good collection of artifacts, Harry said. Harry, Hermione started. I know, he said. I know what it is. I've sat with it since February. And he looked at his hands. The anchor rune on his right palm, the warmth of everything he'd built pressing gently back at him. The forge is mine. What it's given me is mine. Everything I've built, every artifact, the compass and the cloak and all of it, those are permanent. Real. The forge going into the anchor doesn't erase any of that. It just means no more new things made this way. You'd be ordinary, Ron said, and he wasn't saying it as an insult, he was saying it with the full weight of understanding what Harry was offering to give up. I'd be alive, Harry said. And so would you. And so would most of the people who'd otherwise die in the war. Voldemort is going to restart in June. The fire had burned low. The castle breathed. Hermione said, "Is there any other way?" "I've looked for 2 years," Harry said. "This is the cleanest solution I've found. The only one that ends it completely without a body count I'm not willing to accept." Another silence. Then Ron said something that Harry wouldn't forget for the rest of his life: "You built everything you have from nothing. In 4 years. If the forge goes and you get to keep yourself, Harry, you're still the person who made all of it. You'll make other things. Different things." He shrugged, but his voice was warm and entirely serious. "You're a maker. That doesn't go with the forge." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "All right." June came hot and still over Hogwarts, the grounds green and the lake like glass, and the Triwizard Maze standing in the transformed Quidditch pitch, tall and dark and full of things that moved. Harry walked into it last, as his name had been drawn last. He wore the forge-bound cloak. He had the gauntlet and the song-steel wand and the holly wand both and the compass and the truth disc. He had the anchor of souls in his left breast pocket, the finished artifact, a flat disc of forged stone iron with every rune he'd ever learned and some he'd invented himself pressed into its surface in a pattern that Hermione had said, looking at it, was the most beautiful thing she'd seen, about the size of his palm, light enough that he barely felt it. He walked through the maze with the compass in one hand and the song-steel wand in the other. He didn't hurry. He moved with the economy of someone who knew where they were going and what they'd find when they got there. The maze's creatures he redirected or avoided, no time for unnecessary conflict. He found Cedric Diggory in the eastern corridor, trapped under a curse that had taken his legs, and broke it with the song-steel wand and helped him up. "The cup is a port key," Harry said. Cedric stared at him. "What?" "The Triwizard Cup. It's been rigged as a port key to transport whoever touches it to Voldemort." He held Cedric's gaze steadily. "I'm going to go touch it anyway." "You should not. If you know it's, why would you?" "Because I'm ready for what's on the other side," Harry said. "You're not, and that's not a criticism. Go find the exit. You've competed well." Cedric looked at him with the expression of someone confronting a reality that doesn't fit the categories available. Then he said, "Be careful," which was honest and genuine, and went. Harry found the cup at the maze's center, a gleaming silver trophy sitting on a pedestal of conjured stone. He stood before it and took the anchor of souls from his breast pocket. He held it in his left hand. He pressed his right hand against it and let the forge burn into it, all of it, everything, pouring the accumulated crafting capacity of 4 years of work into the artifact's runic array, filling every channel, locking every rune to its function. The anchor blazed golden in his palm, warm as a sun, every rune blazing in sequence, and Harry felt the forge, which had been the most constant thing in his life since his 11th birthday, the voice like a forged fire that had learned to speak, the presence that had taught him everything he knew of his own power. He felt it pour into the anchor completely. It took about 90 seconds. When it was done, the anchor was blazing and Harry's chest was different, not empty. He was still himself, his magic was still there, his capacity still real, but the specific quality of the forge, the particular golden warmth that had burned in him since he was 11 years old in a cupboard in the dark, was now in the disc. It was still his. Held in the artifact rather than in him. He took a breath. Let it settle. Then he touched the cup. The graveyard was dark and full of old stone and a man carrying a bundle and a high cold voice saying kill the spare, which would have been terrifying if Harry had not spent 4 years building toward this exact moment. He dodged the killing curse, it hit the headstone behind him and the headstone exploded, and came up with both wands drawn, the song steel in his right and the holly in his left, and the anchor blazing in his breast pocket. Wormtail, Pettigrew, whom he'd been expecting to see, recaptured after his trial, escaped again with the specific slipperiness of a man who had made a career of surviving by being overlooked. Pettigrew had a cauldron. Harry understood what was coming. He'd read about this too. The resurrection ritual. Bone and flesh and blood. He moved before Pettigrew finished the first component. Not toward them, toward the cauldron. He pressed his hand against the cold iron of the cauldron's side and pushed a single rune into it, a precise and careful rune that took about 4 seconds, and the rune was a variation of the anchor rune he'd put in the philosopher's stone chamber, not preventing movement, but altering the cauldron's runic compatibility with the ritual's function. It would still produce a body. But the body would be like a vessel with a cracked bottom, capable of holding Voldemort's primary soul fragment for exactly long enough for the anchor to function. Then Wormtail grabbed him and the ritual proceeded. Voldemort rose. He was tall and white and terrible and entirely certain of his own supremacy, and he looked at Harry with red eyes that had nothing human left in them and said, in a voice like winter, Harry Potter. Tom, Harry said. The red eyes went still. That particular stillness was fury shaped into a point. Voldemort raised his wand and Harry raised both of his, and the anchor in his breast pocket blazed so hot that he could feel it through his robes, and the graveyard filled with the sound of his mother's murderer's voice casting the words that had always been meant to kill him. Harry cast something different. Not Expelliarmus. Not a shield. He cast the activation sequence for the Anchor of Souls, 17 runes in sequence, spoken aloud in the language of runic artificing which was not English and not Latin and was something older than either, and the anchor leapt from his pocket and blazed in the air between them, enormous now, the forged stone disc expanding as it activated into something that filled the space between him and Voldemort with golden light. Voldemort's curse hit the anchor and the anchor held it and redirected it inward, not at Harry, not at Voldemort, inward toward the anchor's own function, converting the killing intent into pulling force, drawing the soul fragments through every connection they had with the fragment in Harry's scar. The snake, Nagini, screamed somewhere across the graveyard. Voldemort screamed. Not in pain, in recognition. He felt it, felt every anchor he'd built being pulled toward the center, felt the distributed architecture of his fractured self being gathered like threads being pulled through a needle, and the red eyes landed on Harry with an expression that was beyond fury, was something older and more absolute, the expression of something realizing it has been outbuilt. Harry felt the scar fragment go. It was strange. Not painful. The connection to Voldemort that had lived in his forehead since infancy simply, released. Like a cord resolving. And the fragment drew out along the pull of the anchor, joining the rest, and the anchor bound them all in Voldemort's collapsing body with the permanence of the best runic work Harry had ever done, which was saying a great deal. Voldemort fell to his knees. Not dead. Harry had promised himself it wouldn't be death. The body held, the cracked vessel held long enough for the binding to complete. Voldemort knelt in the graveyard dirt with every fragment of his soul gathered back to him and anchored there, in him, to him, the Horcrux architecture dismantled at the root. He was complete, for the first time in decades, in the way that a thing that has been badly broken and very badly mended is complete, holding together, but without the places to hide things. He looked up at Harry. "What have you done?" he said, and it wasn't fury now. It was something more frightened than that. "I made something," Harry said. "It does what I built it to do." He summoned the port key. He'd prepared a return port key, a small stone he'd runed in advance and pocketed before the maze, because planning for the return trip was basic, and pressed it to the anchored disc which had fallen to the ground when its function completed, and he was back at Hogwarts in the Quidditch pitch with the sound of the crowd and the light of torches and Hermione reaching him before he'd fully registered the ground under him. What happened after was several kinds of chaos occurring simultaneously. Moody, who was Bartemius Crouch Jr., who had been on polyjuice potion since September and whose father's body was somewhere on the grounds, had tried to take Harry from the maze's exit and had been intercepted by Dumbledore, who had apparently been watching the whole of the third task with a readiness that suggested he'd been expecting something to go wrong. Crouch Jr. was contained. The real Moody was found in a magical trunk in his own office, alive and ferocious, which was entirely consistent with everything Harry knew about Mad-Eye Moody's personality. Voldemort was in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, on his knees in the dirt, in a body that was real and functional and utterly without the distributed soul architecture that had made him what he was. The Ministry, when they went, which took 12 hours of Dumbledore's insistence and then 10 more hours of bureaucratic process, found him there. He was alive. He was capable of speech and coherent thought. He was, however, clearly not the person he'd been, and a full Wisengamot hearing convened in August would spend 3 weeks determining what, exactly, he was, and what was to be done about it. Harry didn't attend. He sent another written account and let the machinery of the wizarding world process its own history. The anchored disc was on Harry's desk in the dormitory on the last night of term, warm and dark and finished. The runes were dormant now, the function complete, the array at rest. He picked it up and felt its weight, all those runes he'd pressed in one by one, all the forge's last capacity poured into its channels. He held it and waited for the grief of what was gone. What he felt instead was the forge's echo in the artifact, not the living warmth in his chest anymore, but the same warmth reflected from the disc, permanently his in a different form. Ron was packing his trunk with the approach to organization he always brought to packing, which was to say none. Hermione was reading, because she was always reading. The dormitory was comfortable and warm and entirely normal. Harry put the disc down and picked up the songsteel wand. It was warm in his hand, his magic moving through it exactly as it always had. He cast a simple lumos. The light that came from the tip was the same quality it had always been. Clean and real and his. He was still himself. He was still a maker. He was a wizard who had built, in 4 years, a gauntlet that could ward away killing curses, a cloak of shadow thread that made him part of every room he entered, a compass that saw through every lie, a cage that had held a traitor for justice, a wand that was pure extension of his own intent, and a disc that had done something no other wizard in recorded history had thought to do. He was a wizard who had unmade 4 Horcruxes and ended a war without a body count. He was 11 years old in a cupboard, holding a golden light he didn't understand yet. He was 12, pressing runes into stone by firelight. He was 13, hearing his mother's voice in the dark and letting the forge answer it. He was 14, pouring everything he'd ever been given into a disc that did exactly what it was built to do. "Oi," Ron said, looking at him from across the dormitory. "You've got that face on." "What face?" "The one where you're having an important thought and not telling us." Hermione looked up from her book. Harry looked at both of them, Ron with the Weasley red and the honest grin and the loyalty that never needed explaining, Hermione with the bright eyes and the notebook and the precision that was also, always, warmth. "I was thinking," Harry said, "about what comes next." "Such as?" Hermione said. He reached into his desk drawer and took out his notebook. He turned to a new page. At the top he wrote 3 words and turned it so they could see. "What to build next." Ron made a sound of great contentment and abandoned the packing. Hermione closed the book. They pulled chairs toward the desk without being asked, and Harry uncapped his quill, and the 3 of them sat in the warm light of a June evening at the end of the most important year of their lives and began, with the ease and pleasure of people who have found their work and are not afraid of it, to plan. The artifacts Harry had made were still in the world. The gauntlet in its case. The cloak on its hook. The compass on the shelf. The cage in the drawer. The songsteel wand in his hand. The anchor on the desk, complete and resting and real. They would all outlast the people who'd needed them. That was the gift and the burden, exactly as Ollivander had said, 3 years ago in that dusty shop. Harry looked at the blank page. The blank page looked back. He put the quill to it and started writing.